The light was fading, a process Brother Elias knew intimately. It was not a sudden vanishing act, but a slow, deliberate withdrawal, a long, whispered adieu from the day. He stood in the western edge of the Abbey garden, his posture as rooted and still as the old cedar tree beside him, and watched the evening unfold. St. Jude's Abbey stood perched on the high, gray cliffs overlooking the sea. It was a place known more for its quietude than its size, a sanctuary built not against the world, but simply apart from it, where the loudest sounds were the rhythm of the waves and the sigh of the wind through the pines. Brother Elias was the Abbey's keeper of the ground, a title he'd worn for nearly 50 years. His hands, gnarled and sun-weathered, knew the texture of the soil better than they knew the feel of soft cloth. Today, his task was finished. The last row of late-season chamomile had been turned and the gate to the lower fields secured. Now, all that remained was the sacred ritual of evening observation. He lowered his gaze from the horizon and focused on the garden itself. The late light, a deep, liquid gold, painted the worn stone walls a warm russet. Every leaf, every stalk of lavender, every droplet of moisture clinging to the sage seemed to hold a small, trembling lamp within it. This was the moment of revelation, when the world paused and showed its true, soft-edged beauty. Elias began his slow walk back toward the cloister, his worn leather sandals making only the faintest scuff on the flagstones. His steps were measured, his breathing deep and even. Inhaled the cool air, exhaled the day's labor. He repeated this silent rhythm, a simple prayer of the body. The air smelled of damp earth and salt, overlaid by the faint, comforting sharpness of wood smoke drifting from the kitchen chimney. It was a scent of permanence, of things that remained steady regardless of the world's clamor. He passed the rose trellis, a structure of aged oak that leaned slightly to the north, bowed by generations of wind and weight. The last of the summer roses, creamy white with centers of soft peach, were tightly closed, already sleeping. Elias paused, not to touch them, but simply to observe their stillness. He remembered the verse he often pondered while tending them. "Be still, and know that I am God." The stillness of a sleeping rose, preparing in silence for the coming light, felt like the purest form of trust. He walked past the central fountain. It was a simple, stone basin where water trickled from the mouth of a sculpted angel, its face worn smooth by time and the constant kiss of the stream. The sound it made was not a splash or a rush, but a quiet, continuous whisper, a sound that erased all other noises from the mind. Drip, whisper, peace. The water pooled, clear and cool, reflecting the last sliver of blue from the western sky. Brother Elias felt the familiar, gentle ache in his knees and the slow pull in his shoulders. It was a welcome ache, the sign of a day well spent, of energy given wholly to the creation and preservation of beauty. He was not a man of grand sermons or theological argument. His faith was expressed in the turning of the soil, the pruning of the vine, the patient waiting for growth. He reached the sheltered bench beneath the ancient olive tree, the tree that tradition claimed was planted by the Abbey's founder 7 centuries ago. The bark was thick, furrowed, and silvery gray, sheltering a space where the air always felt warmer, heavier with history and grace. Elias sat, placing his hands on his lap, palms up. He watched the final curtain of light draw across the valley below. In the distance, across the valley floor, he could just make out the few scattered lamps of the nearest village. They seemed like tiny, hesitant pinpricks, fragile against the growing dark. He thought of the people down there, concluding their complex days of commerce, family, and worry. He sent a silent, breath-held prayer toward those lights, a blessing of rest and renewal. The transition from dusk to twilight was now complete. The world had turned from gold to indigo. The details of the garden were no longer distinct, but merged into deep, comforting shapes. The dark mass of the hedges, the gentle silhouette of the cypress trees pointing toward the emerging stars. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting his inner vision take over. He saw not the plants, but the structure of their life beneath the soil, the quiet, ceaseless work of roots finding nourishment, drawing strength from the hidden reservoirs. He often thought of the parable of the sower. The true miracle was not the scattering of the seed, but the secret, patient tenacity of the seed once it was buried. The seed must know the dark before it sees the light. This thought was a cornerstone of his understanding of faith. It was in the necessary, rich darkness that the deep work was done, the breaking open, the reaching down, the gathering of strength for the climb. The periods of waiting, of uncertainty, of deep night, these were the most fertile times. He opened his eyes and looked up. The first star had appeared, a brilliant, unwavering point above the spire of the chapel. It was Arcturus, he believed, or perhaps Vega, a star he had watched rise and fall over thousands of nights. The sea now made a low, sustained hum against the cliffs, a sound that was both vast and intimate. It was a sound that told of eternity, of something far greater than any single human life, yet always present, always listening. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying the coolness of the deep ocean. Elias felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for specific gifts, but for the overarching gift of existence, of place, and of the steady, loving presence he felt here in the quiet corner of the world. He rose slowly, his old joints protesting softly, and began the final, shortest part of his evening journey, the walk to the chapel for the final compline service. He left the garden gate unlatched, not out of carelessness, but as an act of quiet trust, a symbolic invitation for any who needed the peace it offered. The world was resting. The earth was silent. Brother Elias was ready for the night. The moon, just past half full, had begun its quiet ascent, a silver coin rising above the eastern hills, promising light even in the deepest hours of the night. His footsteps were the last sound, measured and fading, as he turned toward the sanctuary. The light within the chapel, a warm, golden stain against the ancient stone, seemed to call him home. The cold stone of the cloister walk offered a profound contrast to the lingering warmth of the garden soil. Brother Elias moved through the arched passages, the darkness here deeper and more enclosed than the soft twilight outside. The air was cool, carrying the faint, clean scent of old lime mortar and beeswax polish. The cloister was the heart of the Abbey's architecture, a square of sheltered contemplation surrounding a simple grassy quad. It was where the brothers walked in silence, recited their hours, and carried their burdens in quiet communion. Tonight, it felt like the deep, restful chest of the Abbey, inhaling the sea breeze and holding the silence. Elias focused on the texture beneath his feet, the slight unevenness of the stones, polished by centuries of passing feet. Each footfall was a reminder of the thousands who had walked this path before him, seeking the same solace, praying the same prayers. He was a small, temporary link in a long, unbroken chain of stillness and devotion. He reached the heavy oak door of the chapel. A single, tall candle burned steadily inside a niche just beside the entrance, its flame unwavering despite the draft. It cast long, dancing shadows of the door's iron hinges onto the wall, turning the simple hallway into a canvas of shifting shapes and gentle light. He pushed the door inward. It was stiff, moving with a quiet, satisfying groan, a familiar sound, a greeting. Inside, the chapel was already dim, illuminated only by a few oil lamps and the constant, eternal red glow of the sanctuary lamp, hanging suspended before the altar. That small, persistent light, burning always, was the truest symbol of the Abbey's faith, a humble, constant presence, never extinguished. The few remaining brothers were already seated in the choir stalls. They were men aged by prayer and work, their faces gentle and accustomed to silence. They sat erect, robes pooling around them, each a solid column of rest. There was Brother Thomas, whose quiet laughter tended the bees, and Father Abbot Michael, whose heavy sighs often revealed the weight of his spiritual stewardship. Elias slid into his usual stall. The wood was cold and smooth beneath his hands. He settled in, allowing his body to find its posture of rest. He closed his eyes, and the final noises of the day, the settling of the stone, the soft cough of a brother, the rustle of a heavy robe, faded away. The service of Compline, the final prayer of the day, began. It was known as the night office, a time to surrender the day's worries and entrust the coming night to the divine care. The abbot's voice, low and resonant, began the reading. The Lord Almighty grant us a quiet night and a perfect end. The collective response of the few voices, one smoothed by repetition, was barely above a whisper. The psalm chosen for the evening was one Elias knew by heart, the words a gentle tide washing over his tired mind. He didn't focus on the meaning of each word, but on the comforting sound of the language, the slow, meditative cadence of the ancient text. It was a cradle song of faith. In peace, I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. The simple phrase repeated in the quiet hall. In peace, lie down and sleep, in safety. These were not intellectual truths, but felt assurances, echoing off the stone walls and settling deep into the quiet spaces of the soul. As the prayers continued, Elias felt his own thoughts slow, smoothing like stones tumbled by a stream. The anxieties of the day, the concerns about the unexpected late frost or the worn tread of his boots, retreated to the edge of his awareness, no longer urgent. He thought instead of the lamp, the sanctuary lamp. It had been lit on the day he took his vows, and it had been burning for nearly 50 years. Generations of care, of refilling the oil, of trimming the wick, had kept that promise of light alive. It was the epitome of the Abbey's vocation, a slow, unceasing attention to a small, vital flame. After the final blessing, the chapel dissolved into profound, living silence. The brothers rose, making no sound, and began to disperse. They left not in haste, but with the quiet dignity of those whose purpose is settled. Elias remained for a moment longer, breathing the heavy, still air of the sanctuary. He bowed deeply toward the altar and then turned, his heart now as quiet as the stone around him. He was the last to leave. He paused at the door, securing the latch with a soft click, and then turned down the long, narrow corridor that led to his cell. This corridor was different from the cloister. It was dark, lit only by the faint light filtering from the distant kitchen or the rising moon outside the high windows. Elias carried a small, brass oil lamp with him now, a personal lantern whose light was just enough to illuminate his immediate path. The lantern's light was a circle of soft, amber warmth thrown onto the flagstones. It did not try to conquer the vast darkness of the hallway, but simply illuminated the next step. Elias understood this perfectly. Faith was not about seeing the entire road ahead, but about having enough light for the present moment. He did not need to see the entire span of the night, only the next footfall. His cell, a small room with a window overlooking the eastern hills, was a study in simplicity. A narrow cot, a rough-hewn wooden desk, a single wooden crucifix carved by a long-gone brother. It held only essentials, allowing the mind to rest, unburdened by possessions. Elias set his brass lamp on the small desk. Its flame flickered momentarily, then steadied. He placed his worn robe on the hook and sat on the edge of the cot. He took a few slow, deep breaths, listening now only to the soft, distant murmur of the sea and the internal silence of his own heart. The sea sound was a great, steady heartbeat, the rhythm of the timeless world. He looked out the window. The moon was higher now, a white pearl against the deep, star-strewn velvet of the sky. The stars, countless and silent, spoke of a grandeur that dwarfed all human striving, a vast, complex order governed by love. Before extinguishing the lamp, Elias performed his last act of the day, a small ritual of reading. He opened his small, much-handled book of prayers, not to a new lesson, but to a familiar passage from the Gospels, the Beatitudes, the blessings of the humble. He read the words slowly, soundlessly, tracing them with his eye. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. He paused at the word peacemakers. It was not a grand call to halt wars, but a quiet reminder of the daily, inner work required to cultivate peace within oneself, to be a small source of calm in a restless world. The garden was his peace, the quiet act of surrender to God's order. He closed the book. The message was complete. The day was done. Elias reached for the lamp. With a gentle exhale, he pinched the wick, extinguishing the small flame. The darkness that enveloped the room was not empty, but full. It was the dense, restful, nourishing darkness of the sleeping earth, the darkness where seeds wait and rest is deep. He slid under the rough blanket. His mind remained quiet, settled. As he drifted toward sleep, His last conscious thought was of the Abbey itself, standing silent and steady on the cliff, a small, humble beacon entrusted to the care of a vast and loving providence. The work was finished. The night was safe. Sleep came then, like a gentle, cool wave washing him onto the silent shore of rest. The night deepened around Brother Elias, settling into the profound quiet known only to stone walls and sleeping fields. His sleep was not one of turmoil, but of stillness, a reflection of the ordered, disciplined peace he sought during his waking hours. It was the deep rest promised in the Psalms, a surrender to the stillness of the divine embrace. He did not dream in pictures or drama, but in sensations, the gentle warmth of the blanket, the distant, muffled sound of the sea, which, in the silence, seemed to be breathing in and out, a massive, rhythmic lung of the world. He felt the cold permanence of the Abbey stone against the warmth of his small cell. He was anchored, held fast against the flow of time. In the hour just before the first hint of dawn, that time known as vigils, Elias stirred. It was not the abrupt awakening of worry, but the natural, gentle rising of a body accustomed to the rhythm of prayer and earth. The darkness in the room was absolute, yet he knew precisely where he was and what surrounded him. He lay for a long moment, simply listening. The Abbey was silent, utterly hushed. Even the wind seemed to have rested its wings. This was the quietest hour of the 24, the nadir of activity, the time when all things were most deeply immersed in their own essence. In the Christian tradition, this hour held a sacred significance. It was the time of waiting, of watching, the time before the resurrection of light. Elias found a deep comfort in this expectant silence. It reminded him that profound change and renewal often begin not in a burst of noise, but in the deepest quiet. He shifted slightly on his cot. The rough fabric of the wool blanket rasped softly, a tiny, momentary disturbance swallowed instantly by the vast silence. Elias began his morning prayer while still lying down, whispering the ancient words only in his mind. He offered gratitude for the night's rest and asked for guidance for the day ahead. His prayer was simple, agrarian. He prayed for the health of the soil, for the resilience of the roots, and for the purity of the water that fed the Abbey. He prayed to be a faithful keeper, a steward of the small patch of the world entrusted to his care. He thought of the seeds buried in the winter soil. They were resting now, undergoing the slow, secret process of transformation, taking in the cold moisture, gathering the potential for life. They were entirely dependent on the faithful rhythm of the seasons, the unchangeable promise of spring. Their trust was absolute. This was the lesson the garden taught him every day. Trust the process that is hidden, that you cannot rush or force. Trust the dark hours as much as the light. He sat up slowly, easing his legs over the side of the cot. He felt the chill of the floorboards beneath his feet, a shock of cold that was grounding. Elias did not light his lamp. He did not need it yet. His eyes, long accustomed to the darkness, could discern the faint outline of the window, a pale rectangle in the wall. He moved to the small wooden desk and took up the book of prayers he had closed the night before. This time, he didn't read, but simply held the book, feeling the texture of its worn leather cover. The shape of it settled perfectly into his palm. It was a tangible connection to the history of his faith, a physical object imbued with thousands of hours of quiet devotion. He stood by the window, peering out toward the eastern sky. There was still no light, but he knew the moment was near. He could feel the slight, subtle shift in the temperature, the very faintest hint of purple mixing with the indigo. The darkness was beginning to thin, like heavy cream being dissolved into water. He stood sentinel, a silent, humble witness to the coming dawn. In this moment of deep waiting, Elias felt closest to the heart of the Christian mystery, the promise of light returning after absolute darkness, the certainty of resurrection after the long burial. It was a macrocosm of the daily cycle, played out in the fields, the seeds, and the rising sun. A soft, almost imperceptible sound broke the silence. It was the first call of a lone gull, already awake and riding the early currents of air over the cliff. It was a sharp, clear, yet gentle sound, the signal that the world was beginning to turn again. Elias gave a quiet sigh of peace, a sound of release. The long night was over. The grace of the new day was approaching. He turned away from the window, knowing that soon the first, faint bell would ring, calling the brothers to matins, the morning office, and beginning the cycle of work and worship anew. He would dress now, fetch his heavy boots, and prepare to meet the day's demands, the damp soil, the thirsty roots, the quiet labor that was his life's true prayer. The peace of the night was not forgotten, but carried forward, a secret wellspring of strength for the coming light. The silence of the deep night was finally broken by a sound as old as the Abbey itself, the gentle, measured toll of the matins bell. It was not a harsh clang, but a low, hollow resonance, carried on the air currents, passing from the belfry to the cloisters and settling over the sleeping fields. The bell was an auditory cue for the faithful, a soft instruction, "Rise, the light is coming." Brother Elias was already dressed in his heavy woolen habit and boots. He moved to the door of his cell, the slow, familiar movements requiring no thought. He was operating in the deep muscle memory of routine, which, for him, was a form of restful meditation. He joined the procession of brothers in the dark hallway. They walked single file, moving toward the chapel. No one spoke. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic brushing of their habits against the stone walls and the steady, collective thud of their sandals. It was a movement of unity, a silent river of shared purpose flowing toward the altar. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere had shifted subtly since Compline. The air was colder, crisper, and the small oil lamps seemed to burn with a slightly more intense, eager flame. The brothers settled into their stalls. The matin service was longer than Compline, filled with readings, long psalms, and hymns of anticipation for the new day. It was a time dedicated to renewal, repentance, and the acceptance of the day's work as an offering. Father Abbot Michael's voice, now clearer and stronger than it had been at night, began the service. The readings spoke of creation and providence, the sun rising, the earth yielding its bounty, the unfailing mercy that is new every morning. Elias listened, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the eastern windows, which were slowly changing from black to a luminous, pale gray. With every psalm sung, the promise of the external world seemed to grow stronger. His favorite part was the recitation of the Te Deum, a great ancient hymn of praise. The voices rose in a soft swell, lifting the weight of the night and welcoming the light. The rhythm was slow, hypnotic, and utterly grounding. "We praise thee, O God, we acknowledge thee to be the Lord." As the final benediction was given, the sun was just beginning to touch the highest pane of the stained glass window above the altar. A single, thin shaft of brilliant white light pierced the darkness, momentarily turning the dust motes in the air into glittering gold. It was a moment of profound beauty, the daily, physical manifestation of grace breaking into the humble space of stone and wood. The service complete, Elias did not linger. His prayer was about to move from the chapel to the field. He gave a brief nod to Brother Thomas, and then made his way out of the Abbey and back toward the garden. The world outside had been completely transformed. The indigo darkness was gone, replaced by the cool, ethereal blue of dawn. The air had a sharp, invigorating freshness. The garden was coated in dew. It was everywhere, clinging to the spider webs stretched between the lavender bushes, beating on the broad, flat leaves of the cabbage, and saturating the grass. The dew was cold and clean, turning the earth into a surface of silent, brilliant jewels. Elias stopped, taking his first deep breath of the morning air. He noticed that the scents were different now. The salt air was sharper, and the underlying earthy scent of the soil was mixed with the delicate fragrance of newly opened herbs, mint, rosemary, and thyme, all refreshed by the night's cooling. His first task was one of simple, attentive presence, walking the paths. He needed to survey the garden not for work, but for observation. Had the wind done any damage? Had any early pests begun their destructive work? More importantly, he needed to observe the state of the living things. He walked past the berry bushes. The late raspberries were still tight, but the dew made them shine like rubies. He saw a tiny sparrow hopping near the compost heap, busily sifting through the remains of yesterday's kitchen scraps. The garden was a microcosm of life, a place of constant, quiet consumption and creation. Elias came to the patch of newly sown wheat, a small section reserved for the Abbey's own bread. He knelt down, ignoring the cold dampness that immediately soaked into his boots and the knees of his habit. He ran his fingers lightly over the surface of the soil. It was cool and yielding but firm. The seeds, recently buried, were invisible, but their presence was certain. He felt a deep connection to this patch of earth. It held a future promise, a promise that required only patience and care to be fulfilled. He remembered the words he had heard in the chapel moments before. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain, but if it dies, it produces much fruit. The dying was not an end, but a necessary step toward proliferation. The darkness, the burial, the stillness, these were the fertile stages. His own life, quiet and seemingly unchanging, felt like this grain, buried in the routine of the Abbey, dying to worldly ambition, yet constantly ready to yield fruit in the form of peace and steady service. He rose slowly. The sun had finally cleared the eastern ridge, casting long, sharp shadows. The deep gold light touched the Abbey walls and flooded the garden. The dewdrops, moments ago silent jewels, now sparkled violently, catching fire in the light. The day had truly begun. Elias picked up his basket and pruning shears from the small tool shed. His work for the morning would be to weed the lettuce beds, a meticulous, focused task that required patience and attention to detail. The keeper of the quiet garden was ready to begin his daily prayer of labor, a sustained act of faith placed between the silent earth and the boundless sky. Brother Elias reached the long, rectangular beds where the Abbey's winter lettuce was growing. They were young, their pale green leaves tightly furrowed, resting close to the earth. They represented purity and simplicity, a fragile promise of cool, crisp meals in the months ahead. His work was weeding, a task that required silence, stillness, and immense precision. He knelt down at the end of the first bed, placing his small basket and his short, blunt weeding fork beside him. The ground was cold and slightly yielding beneath his thick habit, but the warmth of the sun, now fully visible and rising quickly, began to settle warmly on his back. He began. This work was not about speed, it was about attention. He knew that the true danger lay not in the visible leaf of the weed, but in the unseen root, deep and tenacious, often winding itself inextricably around the roots of the lettuce. Elias focused his gaze on a small, purple-leafed bindweed, barely an inch tall, yet already sending its fine, white threads down into the soil. He carefully inserted the weeding fork into the earth about an inch away from the bindweed's stem. He pushed gently, levering the soil, easing the earth away from the lettuce root without tearing the delicate structure. The sound of the fork scraping the soil was soft, a small, rhythmic ship, a sound of quiet surgery. When the soil was loose, Elias used his thumb and forefinger to grasp the weed as close to the ground as possible. He did not pull quickly, which would snap the stem and leave the root intact, but slowly, with sustained, even pressure, waiting for the whole intricate system to surrender. Ease, patience, persistence. These were the virtues demanded by the bindweed. Finally, with a soft, tearing sound, the weed came free, a small, slender white root, longer than the visible stem, sometimes entangled with small pebbles or grains of sand. He examined it briefly, confirming the taproot was whole, and then dropped the weed into his basket. The root of the matter is removed, he thought, a phrase that always echoed in his mind during this labor. Elias had always found a deep, meditative parallel between the garden work and the work of the soul. The weeds were the small, persistent habits, the minor selfish inclinations, the unnecessary anxieties that threatened to choke the true growth of faith and kindness. They started small, easy to ignore, but if allowed to thrive, their root systems became impossible to disentangle without damaging the essential good. The work taught him humility. Just as he believed he had cleared a patch perfectly, a tiny, overlooked sprout would emerge the next day, evidence that his attention had wavered. The fight for purity, whether of the soil or the spirit, was never finished. He worked through the beds, inch by inch. The world outside the square of earth he focused on seemed to dissolve. There was only the cool, dark soil, the vibrant green of the lettuce, the small intrusion of the weed, and the rhythmic action of his hands. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, Elias felt the stiff warmth spreading through his bones, chasing away the remnants of the night's chill. A bumblebee, newly awakened, began its slow, heavy patrol over the nearby patch of flowering basil, its deep, drowsy hum a soothing contrast to the silence of the rest of the garden. From the Abbey kitchen, 100 yards away, Elias began to hear the faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of Brother Cook kneading the day's bread dough. It was another sound of life and purposeful labor, a parallel action of hands working with basic ingredients, flour, water, yeast, to bring forth sustenance, just as Elias worked with soil, seed, and water. Mid-morning had arrived, the time when the light was clearest and the shadows sharpest. Elias straightened his back, stretching out the stiffness, and gazed out over the garden. He had cleared one full bed. The lettuce stood now, surrounded by clean, dark soil, ready to draw nourishment without competition. They looked stronger, more peaceful, having been freed from the struggle. Elias stood for a moment, simply appreciating the work of his hands, not as a measure of his skill, but as a testimony to the patience of God, who waits for us, season after season, to clear the weeds from our own hearts. He picked up his tools, moved to the edge of the next bed, and knelt again, ready to return to the quiet, vital work of the root. The day was long, and the garden required endless attention. The morning had peaked, yielding its cool, sharp air to the steady, diffused warmth of midday. Elias had finished his work on the lettuce beds, leaving behind long, clean furrows of dark earth where only the purposeful green of the winter leaves remained. He gathered his tools, dusted the soil from his hands, and stood for a moment, basking in the light. He heard the bell again, not the solemn toll of matins, but the quick, cheerful chime announcing the midday office of none. The rhythmic, cheerful ding-dong was a reminder to pause, to lift the heart from the earth toward the heavens, even in the middle of strenuous work. Elias did not join the brothers in the chapel for this short office. For the keeper of the ground, the rhythm of work sometimes necessitated a private prayer, a silent observance in the field itself. He turned his face toward the sound of the bell, closed his eyes, and recited the simple, ancient prayer of the hour. O God, make speed to save us! O Lord, make haste to help us! This brief, conscious break was crucial. It ensured that the labor did not become mere toil, but remained an act of worship, a continuous meditation interwoven with the physical demand. With the prayer complete, Elias moved on to his next task, tending to the ancient olive tree. This tree was more than just a plant. It was a living relic, a witness. Its roots ran deep under the courtyard stones, and its trunk was gnarled and spiraled, appearing less like wood and more like solidified time. Its silver-green leaves rustled in a constant, low whisper, a sound that always suggested quiet secrets and patient endurance. Elias approached the tree with reverence. He carried a bucket filled with rich, dark mulch, a mixture of aged compost and pine needles, which he intended to spread around the tree's vast base. The mulch served two purposes: to retain moisture and to gently feed the roots hidden beneath the surface. He knelt down at the edge of the root flare, the point where the trunk widens as it meets the ground. He began scooping the mulch with his hands, laying it down in a thick, insulating blanket around the base. The mulch was soft, yielding, and smelled faintly of moss and deep, cool earth. His movements were deliberate, slow arcs of his arms, scattering the dark material evenly. As he worked, he thought of the biblical symbolism of the olive tree: peace, endurance, and the constant provision of oil, the light that sustained the sanctuary lamp. The true lesson of the olive tree, Elias mused, was patience. An olive tree does not rush its growth. It takes centuries to become truly magnificent. It can endure drought, frost, and fire, yet it continues to yield its fruit year after year. It taught him the profound value of persistence in quiet service. It taught him that the most durable and valuable things in life are often those that require the longest time to mature. He remembered the gospel story of Christ praying among the olive trees in Gethsemane, the oil press. It was under the patient watch of trees like this one that the deepest human struggle, the struggle to submit to the divine will, had taken place. The strength for that submission, Elias believed, was drawn from the same deep source that sustained the roots of the olive tree, faith in the hidden goodness of the soil. Elias finished laying the mulch. He then turned his attention to the lower branches. These branches were old, brittle, and often crossed, rubbing against each other and wasting the tree's energy. Pruning was essential, a necessary removal of the old to allow the new light and air to penetrate. He took his heavy, well-oiled pruning shears. They opened and closed with a satisfying, sharp snick. He chose a dead branch, twisted and dry, and applied the blade. Snick. The branch fell softly onto the mulch. He continued slowly, selecting only those parts that were clearly spent or obstructive. The pruning was an act of mercy, not violence, a purification intended to promote life. He was clearing away the distractions, allowing the central, fruitful branches to draw their full measure of sun and air. Elias felt a moment of deep connection to the tree, recognizing its struggle and its tenacity. Like the tree, his own life had endured many seasons, times of fruitfulness and times of drought. The wisdom he had now was the accumulated result of enduring those cycles. He looked up through the canopy of silvery leaves. The sun was directly overhead, dappling the courtyard in shifting patterns of bright light and cool shadow. The gentle breeze whispered through the leaves, a sound that felt like the earth's own steady breathing. The work was restful because it was necessary, and it was necessary because it served the quiet glory of God's creation. The tree was nurtured, the earth was mulched, and Brother Elias was nourished, both in body and spirit, by the simple rhythm of care. The midday sun hung high, casting its shortest, starkest shadows. The Abbey bell chimed again, a slower, more deliberate sequence this time, calling the brothers from their individual labors to the common table for the main meal of the day, sext, or midday dinner. Elias washed his hands thoroughly at the stone basin near the garden shed, scrubbing away the deep stains of mulch and soil. The water was cold and refreshing, a small, invigorating shock to his skin. He dried his hands on a rough linen cloth, feeling the texture of the fabric, a small, familiar comfort. He walked across the cloister and entered the refectory. It was a long, plain hall, cool even on the warmest days, with high, vaulted ceilings that held the quiet air. Along the walls, sturdy wooden tables were set simply with bowls, wooden spoons, and small, rough linen napkins. The brothers took their places along the benches. There was no conversation. Silence was observed during meals, a practice intended to focus the mind on the nourishment being received and to keep the heart free from distraction. Instead of conversation, one of the younger brothers, Brother Joseph, stood at a small pulpit and began to read aloud from a religious text. The gentle, rhythmic monotone of the reader's voice filled the hall, making the words less a matter of active debate and more a background rhythm for meditation. Elias bowed his head as the abbot gave the brief blessing over the food, thanking Providence for the bounty of the earth and the hands that prepared it. The meal was simple, restorative, and almost entirely sourced from the Abbey's own grounds. Thick, dark bread baked that morning by Brother Cook, a hearty, warm lentil stew, and a large bowl of the Abbey's crisp, homegrown lettuce, dressed simply with olive oil pressed from the old tree. Elias ate slowly, deliberately. Each spoonful of the stew was warm and savory, a perfect balance of salt and herb. He focused on the texture of the bread, crusty on the outside and soft within, and the clean, slightly bitter taste of the olive oil. This was eating as an act of awareness, not hurried consumption. He reflected on the simplicity of the meal. In the garden, he worked to remove the weeds that choked the essential plant. Here, the meal itself was free of the weeds of extravagance or unnecessary complexity. It was pure sustenance, a mirror of the simple, true life the Abbey sought to cultivate. He listened to the reader's voice, which spoke this day of the parable of the vineyard workers, a story about labor, time, and the grace of the master who paid the same wage to all, regardless of the length of their toil. Elias found this parable deeply comforting. His own life was a long, slow, steady toil, beginning at Maddens and ending at Compline. He did not seek recognition or a grand reward. He simply sought to be among those who showed up and worked until the sun went down. The lesson of the parable was that the value of the labor rested entirely in the grace of the giver, not the merit of the worker. When the meal concluded, The silence was broken only by the scraping of benches as the brothers rose to depart. Elias then returned to his cell for the customary hour of rest, known as the siesta or merides, a pause intended to preserve energy for the long afternoon ahead. The sun, having reached its apex, was now beginning its slow, predictable decline. The light pouring through his small, unadorned window was brilliant but softened by the deep shadow of the high ceiling. He stretched out on his cot, not to sleep deeply, but to hover at the threshold of rest, allowing his mind to remain aware while his body recovered. He closed his eyes. The silence here was different from the silence of the night. It was the silence of held breath, of intense quietude under the midday sun. All the sounds of morning, the birds, the kitchen bustle, the sharp snick of the pruning shears, were temporarily suspended. Elias felt the deep, restorative weight of his own body sinking into the cot. He practiced the deliberate release of tension, letting his shoulders relax, smoothing the worry lines from his brow, allowing his hands, still faintly smelling of earth, to rest fully open. In this deep, quiet pause, he experienced a brief moment of pure spiritual peace, a sense of unity with the stillness of the Abbey and the steady, unseen life of the garden. He was ready for the afternoon, ready to return to the earth, refreshed and patient. The long day was only half done, and the promise of evening's final rest felt earned and certain. The hour of rest concluded with a quiet, internalized sigh. Brother Elias rose from his cot, feeling the restoration of the brief siesta ripple through his limbs. The afternoon light, though still bright, had lost the aggressive edge of noon, becoming softer, a pale lemon gold filtering through the small window. The world outside felt slower, draped in a deep, peaceful lassitude. He returned to the garden, where the air was heavy and still. The sun had warmed the stone paths and the dark earth, releasing the deep, earthy, almost sweet smell of warm soil. The silence felt different now, less expectant than the morning, and more settled, a silence of steady, ongoing production. Elias's afternoon task was essential and deeply meditative, tending the ancient, narrow irrigation channels that ran through the vegetable plots. Water was the lifeblood of the Highcliffe garden, and ensuring its steady, deliberate flow was a sacred duty. The Abbey's water source was a natural spring high on the hill behind the main buildings. It was channeled through a series of stone and clay conduits, gravity-fed, bringing a constant, cool trickle to the plots. Elias was responsible for clearing any debris, fallen leaves, pebbles, fine silt, that might obstruct the flow, and ensuring the small clay sluice gates were correctly positioned to direct the water to the thirsty beds. He began at the head of the main channel, a shallow, moss-lined trough carved directly into the flagstone. He moved slowly, his body bent low, his shadow long and thin beside him. He carried a small, flat wooden paddle, worn smooth by years of use, which served as his clearing tool. The sound of the water was the central rhythm of this task. It was not a gushing or roaring sound, but a constant, gentle murmur, a quiet, sustained whisper of movement. Flow, 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 the water seemed to say, an endless, reassuring song. As he cleared a section of the channel, pulling out a trapped leaf or dislodging a tiny blockage, the water's voice would change slightly, a brief gurgle, a fractional increase in speed, before settling back into its tranquil, consistent murmur. Elias saw the water not just as a physical necessity, but as a living symbol of divine grace. Grace, like this water, was always available, constantly flowing, requiring no effort to create, but requiring conscious, humble effort to receive. He had to clear the obstructions, the weeds of distraction and selfishness, to allow the sustenance to reach the thirsty roots of his soul. He knelt beside the lettuce bed he had weeded that morning. The soil was firming up beneath the sun. He carefully adjusted the small clay gate leading to the bed. With a soft, sucking sound, a thin, clear stream of water diverted from the main channel and began to snake its way through the furrow between the young plants. The sight was deeply satisfying. The dark earth immediately darkened further as it absorbed the cool moisture. The water sank quickly, disappearing into the soil, vanishing where it was most needed, leaving behind only the evidence of refreshed, deepened color. The plants would drink their fill slowly, steadily, over the next few hours. Elias paused to watch, his focus entirely on the silent miracle of absorption. The water was working its essential, hidden magic. He spent the remainder of the afternoon progressing along the channels, moving with the patient, unhurried pace of the water itself. From the lettuce, to the cabbages, to the newly tilled plot waiting for winter greens, he ensured that the line of life flowed uninterrupted. The sun began its long, elegant slide toward the west, preparing for the dramatic evening Elias loved so well. The shadows of the Abbey buildings stretched longer and longer, providing welcome coolness over the plots. As the light softened, Elias heard the faint, distant sound of the bell ringing again, the call to vespers, the evening prayer. It was a sound that marked the beginning of the end of the day's work. Elias gathered his tools. He left the water running slowly, faithfully, knowing its work would continue long after he had retired for the night. The garden was hydrated, the paths were clear, and his heart was quiet. The day, like the channel he had cleared, had flowed well. The call to vespers, the sunset prayer, was a sound Brother Elias cherished above all others. It was a signal of completion, a peaceful drawing in of the spirit as the light of the world was drawn away. The bell's tone was deep and mellow, a sound that seemed to carry the promise of rest on its vibrations. He made his way back through the garden, moving toward the Abbey structure. The plots he had just watered looked dark and satisfied, the air around them cool and heavy with moisture. The shadows, which moments ago had been long and stretching, were now blurring, merging into a uniform haze of evening purple. Elias stopped at the corner of the herb garden. Before joining the brothers, he performed a small, personal ritual. He selected a few sprigs of lavender, just past their peak bloom, and 2 or 3 pale leaves of lemon balm. These were his evening offering, a fragrant tribute to the day's work, which he would place on the communal washstand. He gathered them carefully, gently pinching the stems so as not to tear them, allowing the deep, calming scent of the lavender to release into the cool air. The simple act of collecting and appreciating the herbs was a final, humble prayer of thanks for the earth's bounty. All things flow from thee, and of thine own have we given thee. He entered the chapel just as the first hymn began. Vespers was the office of light, celebrated as the light failed, focused on the theme of Christ as the eternal, unquenchable light in the darkening world. The windows of the chapel, facing west and south, were awash in the dying glow of the sun. The light was no longer clear and piercing, but soft, warm, and highly saturated, a final, burning palette of orange, rose, and gold. The stone walls, which had been gray all day, now seemed infused with a transient, glorious color. Elias joined in the singing of the Magnificat, Mary's song of praise, which was always recited at vespers. The collective voices of the brothers were a comfort, a sound of shared expectation and gentle humility. He has filled the hungry with good things, and sent the rich away empty. The words resonated deeply with Elias, the keeper of the ground. He saw the wisdom of providence laid out in the garden. The soil demanded humble, patient labor, yet it rewarded that labor with a fullness far beyond expectation. The arrogance of the rich, those who believe they can force or rush the earth, was always met with failure. Only the hungry, the patient, and the meek were truly filled. As the prayers concluded, the sun disappeared entirely below the horizon. The chapel light transitioned instantly from the burning colors of sunset to the soft, enduring glow of the internal oil lamps. It was a powerful, daily reminder that while the light of the sun departs, the light of faith remains, constant and provided. After the service, Elias made his way back to the cloister. The air was now distinctly cool, carrying the sharp dampness of the approaching night. The moon, hidden earlier in the day, was beginning to assert its presence, bathing the courtyard in a silvery, detached light. He walked toward the great well, an ancient stone circle built centuries ago to draw water from the deepest part of the spring's catchment. He paused at the edge, placing his hands on the cold, smooth coping stone. He peered down into the darkness. He could hear the faint, continuous sound of the water, far below, a sound of inexhaustible reserve. He often found reassurance in the well. It represented the hidden source, the deep, constant promise that even when the surface of life seemed dry, the deepest, purest essence was always there, waiting to be drawn up. Elias drew the wooden bucket slowly, steadily, up from the darkness. The old chain rattled softly over the pulley, a slow, gentle grinding sound that was the true voice of the Abbey's endurance. The cool water, drawn up from the deep earth, smelled of stone and pure cold. He poured the fresh water into a small clay pitcher. This was the final act of preparation, ensuring there was fresh water ready for the brothers in the morning. He left the pitcher on the cloister table, a simple, necessary amenity. As he walked back to his cell, the long day was finally pressing its fatigue upon him. But it was a good fatigue, a tiredness free of anxiety, rich with the satisfaction of a day lived wholly in harmony with the rhythms of earth and spirit. He knew that the only thing remaining now was the final surrender of Compline, and then the deep, restorative dark. He looked back at the garden one last time. In the moonlight, the beds were only masses of dark shadow, indistinguishable, resting under the great, quiet expanse of the sky. The keeper of the quiet garden was, for now, also resting. The Abbey was now wrapped entirely in darkness, broken only by the thin, vertical spills of lamplight from the windows and the soft, silvery glow of the moon. Brother Elias joined the few remaining brothers for the last office of the day, Compline, the prayer before sleep. They gathered in the choir stalls again. The air was cool, and the quiet was now absolute, a hushed reverence that seemed to absorb all sound. Compline was the simplest, shortest, and most intimate of the canonical hours, a final cleansing of the spirit before the vulnerability of sleep. The abbot's voice, now a soft, weary murmur, began the reading with the traditional words of invitation. The Lord Almighty grant us a quiet night and a perfect end. The brothers responded in a collective sigh, Amen. The service followed its familiar, soothing pattern. There was the brief confession of sins and imperfections, a release of the day's moral dust, which Elias offered for his moments of impatience with the stubborn roots, or the small flicker of pride at the cleanliness of his lettuce beds. Then came the reading of the short lesson, a simple exhortation to vigilance and trust. Elias's eyes were heavy, his mind ready for rest, yet he listened, allowing the words to settle over him like a protective mantle. The service concluded with the Nunc Dimittis, the Canticle of Simeon, the prayer of the man who, having seen the promised light, was ready to depart in peace. Lord, now let your servant depart in peace, according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation. This prayer was the key to the entire day's rhythm for Elias. It was the acknowledgement that life, lived rightly, led to a peaceful surrender. His work in the soil, his long hours of patient labor, were all aimed at this single point, to be ready, when the final light faded, to depart in peace. The peace he sought in his sleep was a practice run for the great, final rest. As the brothers stood for the final blessing, Elias felt a profound sense of lightness. The day's weight was gone, not discarded carelessly, but laid down in trust. The brothers left the chapel in absolute silence, dispersing into the darkness of the cloisters. Elias made his way back to his cell, guided by the memory of the stone and the faint light from the moon. Once inside, he moved through the final small rituals. He checked the fire grate in the small hearth, banked to keep the embers alive until morning. He knelt briefly beside his cot, his hands resting on the cold floor, and offered a final, wordless prayer for the safety of the sleeping Abbey and the welfare of the world outside its walls. He rose and went to the window. The vast night sky was an intricate tapestry of starshine, cold and brilliant. The Milky Way was visible tonight, a luminous ribbon stretched across the heavens. It was a sight that never failed to remind Elias of the limitless scale of creation and the humbling smallness of his own life. Yet, he felt no fear in the face of this immense darkness. His small life, his patient work, his constant prayer, all were acknowledged and held fast within that cosmic order. The God who held the stars in place also cared for the single grain of wheat in the Abbey garden. He climbed into his cot. The rough wool blanket was familiar and comforting. He lay on his back, his body sinking into the mattress, allowing all muscle tension to drain away. He focused on his breath. Inhale, quiet. Exhale, rest. He felt the deep, continuous hum of the sea, now the only sound in his world, a vast, steady rhythm that rocked the sleeping Abbey. He listened to it not as a sound outside himself, but as a vast, gentle echo of the life force that flowed through everything. The work was done. The heart was still. The light was surrendered. Sleep found Brother Elias quickly and completely, a deep, restorative darkness that was full of the quiet certainty of the coming dawn. He was held fast in the arms of the night, ready to be renewed for the next cycle of grace and growth. The waking was different this morning. Brother Elias did not wake to the promise of sharp, bright light, but to a profound, velvety quietude. The silence was heavier than usual, muffling the distant murmur of the sea and dampening the subtle sounds of the Abbey's awakening. He knew immediately, even before moving, that the morning had brought the mist. He rose slowly, the same measured movements as the day before, but tinged with a deeper sense of introspection. When he reached the window, the world outside was obscured. Where yesterday the vast, starry canvas had offered a view of cosmic scale, today there was only a uniform, pale gray wall pressed against the glass. The sky had descended, wrapping the Abbey in a dense, cool embrace. The Mannon's bell, when it finally tolled, sounded closer and softer than usual, the sound waves absorbed and muted by the thick, floating moisture. It felt less like a command to rise and more like a gentle invitation into a deeper, shared quiet. Elias dressed and joined the silent procession to the chapel. The corridor was unnaturally dim, the small oil lamps struggling to penetrate the gloom. In the chapel, the atmosphere was one of profound intimacy. The stone walls disappeared into the mist-filtered light, and the small cluster of brothers seemed to be suspended in a private, gentle world. The abbot's voice was hushed, almost conversational, as he read the opening prayers. The lack of visual distraction forced a deeper concentration on the words themselves, on the internal landscape of faith. Elias looked at the sanctuary lamp. Its red flame, usually a pinprick of focused light, seemed larger, softer, its glow diffused into the ambient moisture. It was a beautiful illustration of the nature of faith in difficulty. The external landscape was confusing and opaque, but the essential light, the inner conviction, was magnified. The morning prayers focused on faith as a walk in the unseen. Elias pondered the nature of hope, the conviction of things not seen. Today, the world perfectly illustrated this. He knew the garden was there, he knew the ocean was crashing on the cliffs, and he knew the sun was above the mist, even though none of it was visible. He acted on the certainty of things he could not see. After the service, Elias moved to the Abbey gates. The air hit him like a cool, wet cloth, smelling intensely of pine and damp stone. The visibility was perhaps 30 feet, just enough to make out the shape of the outer walls and the dark, blurred mass of the ancient olive tree nearby. He stepped out into the garden. It was a completely different place than the day before. The familiar paths and precise borders were gone. The mist had swallowed the distance, erasing the edges of the plots and making the garden feel infinitely smaller, more mysterious, and more personal. Elias walked slowly, his boots squelching softly on the saturated grass. The ground was profoundly wet, the moisture hanging heavy on every surface. He felt a deep sense of peace in this lack of definition. There were no distractions, no long views demanding his attention, only the immediate 3-foot radius around his own body. He reached the lettuce beds. They were indistinguishable from the surrounding mist, yet when he knelt, he found them exactly where they should be. The young leaves were coated in a fine layer of tiny water droplets, turning them a vibrant, cool green. His task today would be different. With the high moisture content, weeding was pointless. The disturbed roots would just create mud. Instead, his focus shifted to protection and patience. He walked to the small trellis where the climbing beans grew. Their vines, now heavily laden with water, needed gentle guidance. He slowly, deliberately, began to tie the loose vines to the wooden supports using soft twine. The work was methodical, focused entirely on the immediate connection of the vine and the stake. He felt the texture of the twine, the cool roughness of the bean leaves, the firmness of the wood. The simplicity of the task was profoundly meditative. He was binding up the light, ensuring its support structure was sound, allowing the plant to reach vertically into the hidden sky. The mist was a teacher today. It taught that even when vision is restricted, the immediate duty remains clear. One did not need to see the mountain to begin the climb. One only needed to see the next few stones. Elias spent the entire morning in this intimate, contained space, the world narrowed down to the silent language between his hands and the earth. His labor today was not about extraction, but about holding fast, reinforcing, and enduring the damp, quiet beauty of the obscured world. The morning's labor of tethering the bean vines came to a close with the gentle, muffled chime of the midday bell, signaling the office of none and the hour of the meal. Elias wiped the dampness and pine dust from his hands, feeling the stiffness of the prolonged crouching. His muscles ached softly, a deep, satisfying evidence of work done in the cool, silent air. The mist still clung heavily, creating a world of muted sound and soft, indistinct edges. The visibility remained low, turning the short walk from the bean trellis to the Abbey doors into a quiet, sensory experience. The air felt thick, cold on his face, yet his core was warm from his steady exertion. As Elias entered the refectory, the mist had followed, giving the large hall an ethereal quality. The high windows, instead of admitting clear shafts of light, were simply pale, glowing rectangles, illuminating the room with a gentle, diffused radiance. The details of the far wall were softened, and the faces of the brothers gathered at the table seemed serene, touched by a silvery, contemplative light. The silence of the meal was deeper than usual, amplified by the heavy atmospheric pressure of the fog. Brother Joseph, the reader, stood at the pulpit and began the reading. His voice was steady but lacked the usual resonance, sounding closer, more intimate, as if he were reading only for the four men immediately around him. The reading today was from the book of Genesis, focusing on the story of creation, the deliberate, ordered setting of boundaries. Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Elias listened, finding a perfect parallel in the mist-shrouded world outside. The fog was a temporary blurring of those divine boundaries, a moment when the waters above seemed to have rejoined the waters below, reminding man of the original, formless state before order was imposed. Yet, even in the blur, the essential order held fast. The tables were set, the food was prepared, and the brothers were seated in their places. The daily order of faith transcended the temporary chaos of the weather. The meal itself was simple, as always, but intensely comforting on this cold, damp day. Thick soup made from winter squash, rich and warm, served with the Abbey's dense, flavorful bread. The warmth of the soup traveled slowly through Elias's body, chasing away the cold that had settled deep in his clothes. He chewed his bread slowly, focusing on the texture and taste, the honest, earthy sweetness of the squash, the faint sourness of the sourdough. This was the fruit of patience, the result of good soil and the careful stewardship of the Abbey's small larder. He ate with gratitude, knowing that every simple bite was a gift of Providence. When the meal concluded, the brief rest followed. Elias returned to his cell. The mist outside his window created a feeling of profound isolation, as if the Abbey were the only structure left in the world, floating quietly on a sea of gray cloud. He lay down on the cot, resting in the stillness. The lack of external stimulation was a profound invitation to peace. Without sight, without sharp sound, the mind had nothing to grasp onto, nothing to worry about but the steady, internal rhythm of the breath. He allowed his mind to drift toward a single, calming image, the ancient well he had tended the previous evening. He pictured the water, deep below the surface, clear and unaffected by the fog above, its purity guaranteed by the bedrock around it. He held that image, the deep, constant source, independent of the shifting conditions of the surface. This image of the secure, hidden source was his anchor against the obscurity of the day. The world might be obscured, but the essential truth, the deep, sustaining love of God, remained absolutely clear and accessible, waiting in the inner quiet. After the restorative silence, the bell rang, signaling the end of rest. Elias rose, feeling grounded, refreshed, and ready to meet the hazy, indistinct afternoon with patience and an inner, unshakable clarity. The afternoon was a sustained moment of quiet. The mist, unwavering in its density, had become a defining presence, a silent, cool companion to the Abbey's routines. Elias carried no tools but his small, flat trowel and a wooden bucket filled with fresh, damp mortar mix, which he had prepared during his brief rest. His afternoon labor was at the far edge of the Abbey property, where the formal garden gave way to the rougher, wilder cliffside. Here, a low, thick stone wall marked the boundary, a humble barrier against the wind and the incursions of wild growth. Over centuries, the shifting earth and persistent weather had caused sections of the wall to lean or crumble. Elias's job was not reconstruction, but maintenance, the patient, necessary act of mending. He reached the section he had designated for today, a spot where a few stones had tumbled, leaving a gap where the wild thistle and tenacious heather were already beginning to creep through. He knelt beside the gap, the cool, wet stone against his habit. This work was deeply satisfying because it was an assertion of order against chaos. The garden was a space of cultivation, a mirror of the disciplined soul, and the boundary was the perimeter of that discipline. The wall did not seek to lock the world out, but to define a space where deliberate growth could occur, protected from the overwhelming forces of the untamed. Elias began by clearing the gap, gently removing the loose soil and the aggressive roots that had colonized the space. He used his fingers, working slowly, carefully dislodging the thistle root without breaking it, ensuring the clean edge of the stone beneath was exposed. The earth he removed was dark, rich, and intensely cold. Next, he selected 2 flat stones from a stack nearby, stones weathered gray, chosen from the cliffside itself, perfectly fitted to the ancient wall. He held the stones in his hands, feeling their weight, their coolness, and their ingrained sense of permanence. He then took his trowel and spread a modest, even layer of the damp, cool mortar mixed into the void. The mortar smelled faintly of lime and sand, a sharp, clean scent that cut through the humidity of the mist. He worked the mix into the crevices, ensuring a solid base. With slow, careful precision, he set the first stone into place. He tapped it lightly with the wooden handle of the trowel, settling it securely, feeling for the moment when the stone ceased to shift and became truly stable. The second stone followed, pressed tightly against the first. His focus was absolute. It was a matter of finding the balance, the point where 2 rough, uneven surfaces could be persuaded to rest together in perfect, quiet harmony. It required the patience of not forcing the fit, but finding the right angle, the right support, the right amount of mortar to create an enduring piece. Build your house upon the rock, the gospel words came to mind. This work was an immediate, physical meditation on that command. The only thing that truly endures, he realized, is that which is built upon a sure foundation, with materials that respect permanence. The mist, meanwhile, lent a sense of timelessness to the task. He could not see the Abbey, nor the sea, nor the extent of the garden, only the stone, the mortar, and the small, vital section of wall immediately before him. Time seemed to slow down, marked only by the hardening of the mortar and the steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing. He continued this meticulous work, stone by stone, replacing the missing boundary. The only sound was the soft squelch of the wet mortar and the occasional gentle tap of the trowel. As the afternoon wore on and the work neared completion, a change occurred. Not a sudden break, but a subtle thinning of the atmosphere. Elias noticed the light intensifying from pale gray to a translucent, pearlescent white. He looked up, and for the first time in hours, he could vaguely make out the dark, blurred outline of the chapel spire, a tall, shadowy presence reaching into the heavens. The mist had not lifted, but it had yielded enough to reveal the sacred structure it had hidden. The sight was a gentle, beautiful affirmation of perseverance. The light and the boundaries endure, even when obscured by the uncertainty of the world. Elias knew the light was fading, and his work was done for the day. He carefully wiped his trowel clean and packed the remaining mortar mix. He stood back and surveyed the mended section. It was stable, solid, and quiet, a small, restored piece of the perimeter, ready to hold fast against the night. The mist began its slow, deliberate transformation as the light faded toward vespers. It did not vanish, but shifted, turning from a dense, white obscurity to a fine, pale veil threaded with gold and gray. The air grew perceptibly colder, signaling the earth's preparation for night. Brother Elias left the freshly mended wall and walked back through the garden, savoring the feeling of completeness that comes from finishing a necessary and silent task. His hands, though stiff from working the cold mortar, felt the satisfying stiffness of utility. He reached the center of the garden and paused by the small, circular pool fed by the overflow of the angel fountain. In the humid, quiet air, the water was perfectly still, reflecting the soft, muted sky. The surface was a mirror of peace. He considered the day's lesson. The mist had hidden the world, forcing him to work in a state of blind trust, focused only on the immediate task: the vine, the mortar, the root. He realized that this was often how God's grace operated, not through clear, long-distance vision, but through enough immediate light for the next step. The Abbey bell began to toll for vespers, the evening hymn. The sound, still slightly muffled by the damp air, was rich and resonant, calling the faithful to give thanks for the passing day. Elias entered the chapel. The atmosphere was one of profound tranquility. The low light of the oil lamp struggled against the residual daylight filtering through the high, damp windows. The mist outside had the effect of softening every angle, making the interior feel like a deeply hallowed, ancient cave. The service began. The chanting of the psalms was slow, reflective, and low-pitched, a quiet sound perfectly matched to the muted world outside. The Vesper hymn sung this evening was an old one, focused on the theme of the setting sun and the eternal light. Elias found himself concentrating not just on the words, but on the very act of the brothers standing together, their voices weaving into a single, cohesive thread of sound against the vast silence of the evening. O Christ, our light, our morning star, though evening's shadows draw afar, your presence shines beyond the veil, a promise that shall never fail. The melody was simple and repetitive, a tune Elias had known since childhood. It was designed not to excite the mind, but to soothe it, allowing the truth of the lyrics, the constancy of the divine light, to sink beneath the surface of conscious thought. As they sang the final verse, the last vestiges of daylight surrendered. The glass windows turned black, and the sanctuary lamp, the small red heart of the Abbey, seemed to burn with renewed clarity. It was a tangible proof of the hymn's message. The external world may darken, but the internal light is constant. After the service, Elias carried this sense of quiet light back out into the cloister. The mist had begun to condense, settling as a cool, fine dampness on the stones. He paused by the kitchen door, where Brother Cook was clearing the remains of the day's baking. The scent of yeast, warm flour, and cooling wood smoke was deeply comforting. Elias knew his last tasks awaited: a quick check of the water flow from the mountain spring to ensure the channels remained clear through the night, and then the quiet dignity of compline and rest. He walked past the olive tree. In the darkness, its gnarled trunk was barely visible, but Elias reached out a hand and touched the rough, cool bark. The tree stood sentinel, an ancient pillar of endurance and peace, rooted deep and waiting patiently for the return of the sun. He felt his own body settling toward rest, his energy honorably spent. The day had been quiet, disciplined, and full of the simple truth that the most meaningful work is often the work done in the obscurity of the present moment, trusting that the dawn will surely come. The lingering chill of the mist had settled deep into the stone of the Abbey. Brother Elias finished his quick, final inspection of the garden channels, ensuring the diverted stream of water was flowing smoothly to the newly mended boundary wall. He felt the cold, hard reality of the earth one last time, the contrast between the damp, dark soil and the clean, quick rush of the water. He returned to the Abbey and joined the silent gathering for compline. The service tonight was even more hushed than the previous evening, the voices seeming to carry the weight of the dense, wet atmosphere. The silence was not empty, but full of the presence of the night, pressing in on the small circle of lamplit faith. The abbot's voice was a low comfort. The Lord Almighty grant us a quiet night and a perfect end. Elias surrendered the last lingering thoughts of the day. He released the memory of the cold trowel, the damp wool of his habit, and the persistent dampness in the joints of his knees. He placed the day's labor, the quiet struggle against the creeping thistle roots, and the patient mending of the boundary, into the hands of Providence. The psalm chosen for the evening was one of deep, enduring trust, emphasizing protection from hidden fears and the unseen perils of the night. Elias felt the words, less as a defense against external threats, and more as a shield against internal anxieties that might surface in the dark. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day. The greatest terror of the night, Elias knew, was the temptation to worry about tomorrow, to believe that the day's work was insufficient, or that the growth he sought would fail. The final prayer of Compline was the spiritual antidote, the total surrender of the future to the divine will. The service concluded in the deep hush. Elias walked back to his cell, the only sound the soft padding of his sandals on the stone. Once in his cell, the quiet deepened. He did not light his lamp. The darkness was cool, clean, and complete. He sat on the edge of his cot, allowing his body to recognize the shift from work to rest. He closed his eyes and began his final meditation, reflecting on the 2 full days of labor. Day 1 had been focused on extraction, pulling the weeds, cutting away the dead branches. It was the visible, active work of purification. Day 2, the misty day, had been focused on reinforcement, tying the vines, mending the wall. It was the quiet, necessary work of establishing order and support. But the real work, he realized, was neither the extraction nor the reinforcement. It was the unseen waiting that happened in the dark. He thought of the seeds he had planted, invisible beneath the cold soil, and the lettuce roots he had carefully cleared, now drinking the cool water in the darkness. The growth, the increase, the mysterious process by which a single seed breaks open and yields fruit, that was the unseen harvest. It was not dependent on his strength or his cleverness, but on the enduring, faithful laws of creation itself. His role was simply to be the keeper of the conditions, to ensure the soil was prepared, the water flowed, and the boundaries were firm. The miracle of growth was granted by grace, in the quiet, hidden time. Elias lifted his heart in a final, wordless prayer of gratitude for this profound, restful truth. He did not need to strive, he only needed to tend and to wait with patience. He lay down beneath the coarse blanket. The cool, damp air made the warmth of the cot feel particularly comforting. He focused on the vast, continuous silence outside his window, the silence of the sea, the stone, and the sleeping garden. He felt himself sinking, deeply and steadily, into the perfect rest of the night, held fast in the knowledge that the greatest labor was taking place without his intervention, in the quiet, rich darkness of the world. The night's deep rest yielded to a morning of glorious clarity. The mist had completely departed, retreating back to the sea, leaving behind an air that felt profoundly washed, clean, and crystalline. When Brother Elias woke, he saw the eastern sky not just as a pale rectangle, but as a vast, sweeping dome of flawless azure. The matins bell rang out sharply, its sound pure and resonant, carrying far across the newly cleansed landscape. Elias rose with a renewed lightness, the chill and dampness of the previous day entirely forgotten. His body felt strong, aligned with the sharp, clear energy of the morning sun. He hurried to the chapel. The service was joyful, full of the robust praise appropriate for a day of such clear beauty. The psalms were sung with conviction, celebrating the firmament and the stability of the earth, themes that felt especially potent after the uncertainty of the mist. After the blessing, Elias moved swiftly toward the garden. The sunlight, now fully risen, was a blinding gold, emphasizing the sharp edges of the stone walls and making every dewdrop on the grass glitter like liquid fire. The air smelled of dry dust, pine resin, and the intense freshness of the sea. Today's work was one of gathering, not planting or mending. It was the most satisfying task, the moment when labor transitioned into provision. Elias went to the central vegetable beds, carrying his largest basket, lined with a smooth, linen cloth. His first mission was to harvest the Abbey's herbs, the mint, rosemary, and savory, for drying and storage. These herbs were not merely flavorings, they were medicine, preservatives, and ritual components, essential to the Abbey's self-sufficiency. Elias moved slowly through the beds, his hands working with familiar, rhythmic precision. He pinched off the stems just above a pair of leaves, ensuring the plant was encouraged to branch and grow bushier, a gentle pruning that yielded both harvest and future increase. The sun beat warmly on his back. The air around the herb beds was heavy with fragrance, an intoxicating mix of sharp, clean scents. He focused entirely on the texture of the leaves, the tough, needle-like resilience of the rosemary, the soft velvet of the sage, the cool, moist fragility of the mint. He worked in a state of flow, his mind quiet, immersed in the physical reality of the task. He was simply serving as the connection between the life force of the plant and the needs of the community. Once the basket was nearly full of fragrant, freshly cut herbs, Elias moved to the side of the garden where the smaller, rarer vegetables grew, the tender-leaf greens and the late-blooming root vegetables. Here lay his specific focus for the morning, preparing a gift. It was the Abbey's tradition to reserve a portion of the harvest, especially the finest of the produce, not for their own table, but to send to the small, scattered community in the valley below who often struggled through the leaner months. This act of sharing, of giving the first fruits, was the true spiritual apex of the garden year. Elias carefully selected the finest head of purple cabbage, its leaves tight and firm, dusted with a waxy, cool bloom. He dug gently around 3 small, perfect beets, their earthy smell sharp and sweet. He collected a generous bundle of crisp, green beans, which had matured during the misty confinement of the day before. As he worked, he thought of the meaning of the gift. It was not charity given out of abundance, but a sacrifice made from their necessity. The Abbey needed this food, but by giving it away, they reaffirmed their foundational belief that life is not about hoarding, but about trusting that the source is endless. The act of releasing the first and the best created an empty space that Providence was sure to refill. He placed the vegetables carefully into a smaller, separate basket, arranging them like jewels on a bed of fresh mint. The simple arrangement was an act of honor and respect for the recipient. With the small basket full, Elias began his walk towards the eastern gate of the Abbey, the gate that led down the winding path to the valley road. He carried the basket gently, feeling its solid, earthy weight. He passed the ancient olive tree, whose silver leaves shimmered in the clear sun. He paused for a moment, looking out over the fields that sloped toward the distant, bright sea. The world felt vast and open again, beckoning with its clarity. This walk, the walk of the gift, was the final, wordless prayer of the morning. It was the moment when the physical labor in the quiet, hidden garden translated into a visible act of grace and community. Brother Elias stepped through the eastern gate and onto the winding, narrow path that descended the cliff face. The path was worn deep into the earth by centuries of feet and weather, stabilized by loose, flat stones that had to be trod with care. He moved slowly, his aged body navigating the slight decline with patience, ensuring the precious basket of vegetables remained steady on his arm. The air on the path was in constant motion. Here, high above the valley, the sea breeze was strong, clean, and bracing, carrying the distant, rhythmic sound of the surf. Elias could see the world laid out beneath him in stunning clarity. The valley floor was a patchwork of brown and green fields, and the roofs of the small village of Oakhaven were just visible as a cluster of dark tiles near the river bend. He walked with his head slightly bowed, focusing on the careful placement of his feet, yet his mind was deeply engaged. The act of giving was always a source of quiet contemplation for him. He pondered the nature of true wealth. The Abbey possessed very little of the world's currency, but it was rich in the soil, in the water, and in the peace that allowed for slow, steady growth. Giving away their finest produce was a spiritual transaction. It exchanged tangible wealth for intangible grace. He remembered the gospel phrase, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." By placing his treasure in this basket, his heart was drawn outward, away from the self-contained quiet of the Abbey and toward the needs of the wider community. After descending about a quarter of a mile, the path leveled out briefly, leading to a small, sheltered copse of oak trees. It was here, by tradition, that the Abbey's messenger would meet with a representative from Oakhaven. This maintained the necessary distance for the contemplative life, while fulfilling the obligation of stewardship. Elias stopped in the shade of the largest oak. He set the basket down gently on a smooth, gray stone, the vibrant colors of the cabbage and beets resting starkly against the dull rock. He paused, waiting. It was only a few moments before he heard the gentle crunch of boots on the gravel of the valley road below. Soon, a figure appeared, walking with a measured, steady gait. Martha, a woman known for her quiet strength and steadfast charity within the village. She was not young, but moved with a purposeful energy, her gray hair pulled back neatly, her face etched with the lines of hard work and compassion. Martha approached the stone, her eyes meeting Elias's in a simple, respectful acknowledgement. There were no lengthy greetings, no complex exchanges of thanks or blessing. The interaction was as clean and direct as the Abbey's faith. "Brother Elias," she said softly, her voice a calm murmur. "Martha," he replied, his voice rougher than hers, used more to the sound of wind and earth than conversation. Elias simply gestured toward the basket. Martha knelt and lifted the linen cloth, her breath catching slightly at the sight of the perfectly formed vegetables, the deep purple of the cabbage, the glowing red of the beets, the fragrant green of the mint. She understood the quality of the gift. She knew that the Abbey often gave what it could ill afford to spare. She did not offer elaborate thanks, which would have felt like an attempt to repay the unpayable. Instead, she offered a prayer, quietly spoken. "May the field that yields this piece be blessed, and the hands that tend it." Elias nodded, recognizing the prayer as the only appropriate exchange. The blessing was not for him, but for the field, the source of the sustenance, which must continue to yield. Martha carefully lifted the basket, tucking it securely under her arm. The transaction was complete, the silent contract of faith and provision reaffirmed. "Go in peace, brother," she murmured. "And you, Martha, the grace of the Lord be with you." Elias watched her turn and walk back down the path, the small basket of vivid color disappearing slowly among the muted browns and greens of the valley. The gift was gone, released entirely from his control, now performing its function in the wider world. He stood in the oak's shade for a long moment, feeling the sense of emptiness where the basket had rested. It was a good emptiness, a necessary one. He turned then, beginning the slow, uphill climb back toward the Abbey. His steps, though ascending, felt lighter than before, his spirit renewed by the simple, profound act of giving. The path back up the cliff was steeper and more demanding than the descent, yet Brother Elias found his steps were lighter now. The small, pleasant ache in his muscles was a counterpoint to the quiet renewal in his spirit. The basket was gone, but the act of releasing the best of the harvest had filled the resulting emptiness with a quiet, certain joy. He focused on the rhythm of his ascent. Inhale, lift, step. Exhale, push, step. The movement was a kind of physical prayer, a reminder that the spiritual journey, like the physical one, often required a sustained, focused effort to climb toward the heights. As he rose, the panoramic view of the valley widened and clarified. He could see Martha, a tiny, dark figure now, nearing the village below, the basket of colorful vegetables a small, bright spot in the landscape. Elias felt no proprietary sense over the harvest. The yield was now serving its intended purpose, to sustain and connect. He thought of the two opposing forces in his life, the deep, silent contemplation of the Abbey and the necessary, active compassion extended to the valley. The gift was the hinge between the two. The peace cultivated in the garden was poured out into the world, and in turn, the act of giving deepened the peace within. The sun was reaching its zenith. The clear light emphasized the hard edges of the rock and the brilliance of the sea, which was now a dazzling, intense blue. The air, though warm, was constantly refreshed by the crisp sea breeze. Elias came to a stretch of the path where the cliff face was sheer, and the Abbey walls, high above, looked impossibly distant. He paused here, catching his breath, leaning against the sun-warmed boulder. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening only to the wind whistling past the rock face. He remembered the gospel passage from the day before. "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." He realized that the Abbey's greatest treasure was not the food itself, but the potential for life held in the seed and the soil. By giving the harvest, they proved that their true treasure, their faith in the constant provision of the Creator, was securely held, independent of any physical inventory. The soil would not cease to yield simply because they had been generous. Renewed by this reflection, Elias continued the final, steep climb. He entered the eastern gate and found the abbey bathed in the intense, clear light of midday. He went immediately to the refectory, where the bell had just finished ringing for the office of nun. The meal today was simple, perhaps intentionally so, given the morning's generosity. It consisted mainly of thick, savory barley soup and the crust of the day-old bread, saved from the previous morning. There was no fresh lettuce today. Elias ate with a profound sense of satisfaction. The absence of the lettuce was not a sacrifice, but a fulfillment. The emptiness on his plate was tangible proof that the gift had been made and accepted. The simple, humble soup tasted richer than any feast, seasoned by the knowledge of service and the certainty of replenishment. During the meal, the reader spoke of the ancient patriarchs, whose lives were defined by migration, planting, and patient waiting for promised land and posterity. It was a story of hope deferred, yet never abandoned. Elias felt his connection to that long tradition, the slow, trusting rhythm of sowing, nurturing, and waiting. His life was not about fast, spectacular results, but about the steady, faithful commitment to the long haul, to the planting of trees that he himself would never see grow to full maturity. After the meal, Elias took his rest in the cell. The light was so bright it penetrated the closed eyelids, but the silence was deep. He lay on his back, feeling the quiet strength that the ascent had left in his body, a deep, contented weariness. He drifted into the Merides rest, his last conscious thoughts centered on the simple act of the exchange on the path. Two people, speaking few words, bound by an unbreakable covenant of mutual grace. It was the entire Christian life, distilled into a simple, beautiful, practical moment of shared bread and faith. The hour of rest concluded gently, yielding the Abbey to the quiet focus of the afternoon. The sunlight streaming through Elias's cell window was less fierce now, possessing the long, golden quality of the latter day. He rose, feeling the deep refreshment of the Merides rest settled in his limbs. His task this afternoon was one of the most intimate and sacred in the garden cycle, sorting and preparing the seeds for the following year. This work was conducted not in the open fields, but in the cool, dry quiet of the small stone seed house, a detached structure built against the northern wall to ensure consistent temperature and low humidity. Elias unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air was dark, dry, and fragrant with the accumulated scent of years of dried herbs, husks, and essential oils. The walls were lined with meticulously labeled glass jars, clay pots, and small, tightly woven linen bags, each containing the promise of a future harvest. He sat on a low, wooden stool beneath the single, high, arched window that admitted a shaft of pale, clean light. He spread a large sheet of rough parchment across the wooden table and carefully poured a small amount of dark, crescent-shaped bean seeds from a clay jar. His work was simple, quality control. He was inspecting the seeds to remove any that were cracked, too small, discolored, or otherwise imperfect. Only the best, the strongest, and the most whole were preserved to carry forward the Abbey's lineage of crops. Elias picked through the seeds with the tip of his finger, nudging them into piles. His concentration was absolute, a quiet, repetitive focus that was deeply meditative. Slide, inspect, separate. The gentle clicking sound of the hard seeds against the parchment was the only noise in the quiet room. He thought of the seeds as holding a covenant, a sacred, unspoken agreement between the Creator and the earth. Within each dark, seemingly inert speck was the entire blueprint for a plant, a complete, miniature miracle of life ready to burst forth when the conditions were right. The seed was the ultimate lesson in hidden potential and patient waiting. He often pondered the parable of the sower, not just the scattering of the seed, but the mystery of the tiny fragment itself. The potential was present from the start. What mattered was the ground, the condition of the soil, the presence of weeds, the persistence of the rock. His work in the garden was not to force the miracle of life, but simply to prepare the ground to receive the covenant. He was the caretaker of the promise. As he worked, separating the strong seeds from the weak, he realized that he was preparing not just for the next year, but for generations. Some of the seeds in the linen bags were the descendants of plants grown by the first monks of the Abbey, varieties that had adapted perfectly to the thin cliff soil, and the salt air over centuries. He felt a profound connection to the men who had sat in this very room, under this very window, sorting these same strains of life, long before his own birth. It was a sense of unbroken continuity, a quiet inheritance passed down through the humble medium of the seed. The small pile of rejected, imperfect seeds grew slowly. He gathered them and placed them in a separate pile for the compost heap, a return to the earth, a recognition that everything, even failure, served the cycle of renewal. The keepers for the next year, the chosen ones, he returned to their clean, dry clay jar. He sealed the jar, labeled it carefully with the current date, and placed it back on the high shelf, safe and suspended in time. The sun outside the small window began its long descent, casting the room into deep shadow, leaving only the small, bright patch of light on the parchment where Elias had been working. The scent of dried chamomile and lavender filled the air, a silent, comforting assurance of peace. He locked the seed house door and walked out into the cooling garden. The vesper bell would ring soon, calling him to the final act of surrender for the day. But for now, he carried the sense of the seed, of quiet, immense potential held in darkness, waiting faithfully for the moment of its destined rebirth. The sun was nearly touching the western horizon, and the world outside the Abbey walls was bathed in the most profound, contemplative light of the day, that rich, low-angled gold that magnifies the shadows and softens the colors. Brother Elias felt a deep, quiet contentment after his hours spent with the seeds. He carried the awareness of the tiny, hard fragments of life like a secret promise held close to his heart. He walked from the seed house, past the ancient olive tree, whose silvery leaves seemed to catch and scatter the failing light. The air was turning cold rapidly, a clear signal that the long, bright day was drawing its conclusion. As he walked, he reflected on the concept of legacy. His work was not for his own lifetime, but for the continuity of the Abbey and the welfare of the valley community, generation after generation. The seeds he had sorted were his ultimate offering, a faith-filled projection of hope into an unknown future. His peace, he realized, came from surrendering the outcome. He would tend the soil, but the increase was not his to control. The bell began to toll for vespers, slow and majestic, echoing off the high cliffs. In the chapel, the light was spectacular. The stained glass windows, which had been pale and unremarkable during the day, now flared into brilliant light, painting the stone floor with transient, vivid colors of ruby, sapphire, and emerald. It was a fleeting display of glory, a powerful reminder of how much of life's beauty is only revealed when the external world is withdrawing. The Vesper service focused on the theme of continuity and the passing on of light. The brothers chanted the psalms in a steady rhythm, their voices carrying the weight of the day's labor and the hope of tomorrow's grace. Elias listened to the words, seeing them as the seeds of the spiritual life, passed down through tradition, planted in the fertile ground of disciplined faith. Like the bean seeds, they were small, unadorned, yet they contained the power to generate enormous spiritual sustenance. After the Magnificat, as the last of the sun slipped away, the light show vanished, and the chapel settled into the deep, familiar glow of the oil lamps. Elias felt the peace of completion wash over him. He returned to the garden for his final evening task, checking the small wooden cross that marked the grave of Brother Ambrose, his mentor and predecessor as keeper of the ground. The grave was located in a small, quiet corner near the southern wall, where the oldest rose bushes grew. Elias knelt beside the cross. He didn't pray for Ambrose, who was already at rest, but with him. He felt the presence of all the former keepers, standing watch with him over the sleeping earth. He was simply one more servant, connecting the long chain of stewardship. He placed his hand on the cool earth of the grave. "The seeds are sorted, brother," he whispered, a silent promise to the legacy. Rising slowly, Elias moved to the Abbey courtyard for the final office of Compline. The night air was crisp, carrying the strong, clean scent of salt and distance. Compline was the ultimate prayer of trust. "In peace, I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." He surrendered the night, the seeds, and the legacy. Back in his cell, the darkness was complete. He lay down, his body sinking into the deep comfort of the cot. His mind, free of any lingering worry or urgency, was still. He listened to the slow, steady rhythm of his own heartbeat, the quietest sound in the universe. The work was done. The seeds were safe. The Abbey was silent. Brother Elias descended into the deep, restorative darkness, held fast by the profound, enduring peace of the keeper of the quiet garden. Brother Elias awoke to a morning defined by two simple sensations: the profound clarity of the sky and the sharp, clean bite of the cold air. The night had been deep and utterly restful, and he rose feeling a quiet, enduring strength in his bones, the accumulated effect of sustained simplicity and peaceful labor. The matins bell rang, its tone crisp and vibrant, cutting through the stillness of the dawn. In the chapel, the cold was immediate, a deep, pervasive chill that encouraged swift, focused prayer. Elias centered himself, allowing the ritual of the service to provide the internal warmth needed to counter the external cold. The psalms of the morning were hymns of steadfastness, of holding firm in the face of trials, of finding shelter in the constancy of the divine. His truth shall be your shield and buckler. The words resonated as Elias considered the day ahead. His work today was less about the active struggle against the earth and more about the delicate, patient work of preservation, an act that required faith in the slow process of time itself. After matins, he went directly to the small, temporary cold storage near the kitchen, where the herbs he had harvested 2 days prior lay waiting. He gathered the bundles of mint, savory, and thyme, which felt cool and heavy with moisture. His task was to transport them to the Abbey's drying shed, a small, warm stone building located near the bakery, where the residual heat from the ovens ensured a dry, slow cure. Elias walked slowly across the frozen grass toward the shed. The sun, though risen, offered only light, not warmth. The ground crunched softly beneath his heavy boots, a momentary, satisfying sound that instantly dissolved into the quiet air. He unlocked the drying shed. The air inside was in intense contrast to the sharp cold outside. It was warm, dry, and powerfully fragrant. The scent was a dense, layered perfume of past harvests, the sharp, clean resin of pine needles, the dusty, sweet scent of dried chamomile, and the sharp clarity of countless batches of rosemary. The shed was a sensory altar dedicated to the slow transformation of life. The space was small and dark, lit only by a high, narrow window and the warm, golden light Elias carried in his small brass lantern. Rafters crisscrossed the ceiling, laden with hundreds of small, brown bundles of herbs tied with natural twine, hanging upside down like quiet, fragrant bats. Elias set the fresh, green herbs down on a clean wooden table. He prepared his materials, more soft twine and a pair of blunt, well-loved scissors. His work began. He took the fresh mint, separating the larger bunch into smaller, uniform bundles. The leaves were still resilient, cool to the touch. He focused on ensuring that the stems within each bundle were perfectly straight, allowing the maximum surface area for the air to circulate. He then took the twine, looping it carefully around the base of the stems. The knot was crucial, tight enough to hold the weight of the drying herbs, yet loose enough not to crush the stems and impede the flow of moisture. His fingers, gnarled and strong, worked with a surprising delicacy. Loop, cross, tighten, secure. The repetition was profound. As he tied the knots, Elias thought of the purpose of drying. The herb, in its fresh state, was beautiful but perishable. It held great immediate vitality, but that vitality faded within days. The drying process, the slow, gentle surrender of its moisture, allowed the herb's essence to concentrate and endure, becoming useful not for a day, but for a year or more. The fragrant oil and flavor, the life force, became permanent. He saw this process as a clear spiritual metaphor. The self, like the fresh herb, must willingly surrender its superficial, fleshy moisture, its fleeting desires and immediate pride, to the warmth and quiet pressure of discipline. Only through this quiet, patient dying to self could the true, enduring essence of faith and service be revealed, preserved, and made useful. He carried the finished bundles, one by one, to the rafters, carefully selecting a spot with good air circulation. He stood on a low stool, stretching to loop the twine over a rough wooden nail, hanging the mint gently into the darkness. The dry bundles surrounding him were a testament to the passage of time and the grace of providence. They were the silent, preserved history of the Abbey's commitment to self-sufficiency and the belief in the enduring nature of essential things. The morning flowed on in this quiet, purposeful rhythm. The only sounds were the soft, dry rustle of the hanging bundles whenever Elias moved, and the gentle snip of his shears. He worked until the Abbey bell announced the midday office. He left the fresh herbs hanging, beginning their slow, quiet journey toward permanence, and stepped out into the bright, clear light. The scent of the shed clung to his habit, a fragrant assurance of the goodness that comes from patient, necessary surrender. The bell for the office of none chimed its steady, familiar rhythm, drawing Brother Elias from the aromatic warmth of the drying shed to the cool neutrality of the refectory. The midday meal was once again simple, a thick, wholesome porridge made from oats and a few dried berries, served with small portions of hard cheese. Elias ate slowly, focusing on the rough texture of the porridge and the sharp, clean taste of the cheese. The meal, served in silence, was a profound act of grounding, a necessary intermission that anchored the busy hands and the reflecting mind. The reader's voice today spoke of the necessity of keeping one's lamps trimmed and ready, a passage Elias understood literally as well as spiritually. He thought of his small brass lantern and the work it took to keep the wick pure and the oil level full. Following the meal and the brief, restorative Merides rest in his cell, Elias moved toward his next afternoon task, the preservation of the tools. This was not a hurried task, but a meticulous, focused labor of appreciation. The tools were the essential instruments of his prayer, and their condition reflected the quality of his dedication. He entered the small, earthen-floored tool shed. The space was dim, smelling strongly of wood, rust, and the faint, sweet scent of linseed oil. He sat on an upturned wooden crate and began to gather the instruments he had used over the past few days: the sturdy hoe, the short weeding fork, the pruning shears, and the well-loved trowel. Each tool was brought to the single workbench, a slab of thick, dark oak worn smooth by years of use. Elias spread out a piece of oilcloth and began with the weeding fork. The metal tines were still caked with dry, caked soil from the lettuce beds. Elias took a piece of rough canvas and began to scrub the metal, slowly and firmly. The friction of the canvas against the rust and dirt created a soft, scraping sound, a rhythmic shusha that was instantly soothing. He focused on revealing the original, smooth surface of the steel. The cleaning was not just for appearance. It was essential for the efficiency of the tool. A clean tool glides easily through the earth, requiring less force and causing less disturbance to the surrounding roots. It was an act of nonviolence toward the soil. Once the fork was clean, Elias took a small, flat stone, a whetstone, and began to work on the edges of the tines. He ran the stone along the metal with a consistent, gentle pressure, applying a few drops of water to keep the surface cool. The sound changed now, becoming a soft, metallic whish, 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 a high, smooth sound of metal meeting stone. He worked until the edges were sharp and clean, capable of cutting cleanly through the persistent root of the bindweed. The sharpness was not aggression, but precision, the ability to perform a necessary task with minimal effort. Elias found a deep, meditative parallel in this work. The tools of his spiritual life, prayer, silence, humility, also required constant maintenance. They became dull with neglect, requiring the friction of honesty, the scrubbing canvas, and the sharp attention of discipline, the whetstone, to restore their effectiveness. He moved on to the pruning shears, applying a small amount of warm linseed oil to the central pivot and the springs. The oil soaked slowly into the metal, quieting the small creaks and ensuring the blades closed with a smooth, silent snick. The oil was a small, preserving sacrifice, protecting the tool from the constant threat of corrosive rust. He thought of rust as worry or malice, the small, corrosive thoughts that slowly eat away at the soul's ability to act clearly and effectively. The oil was the antidote, the daily practice of forgiveness and quiet trust, which shielded the heart from corrosion. Elias spent the remainder of the afternoon in this quiet rhythm of cleaning and sharpening. The light outside the shed window grew long and golden, streaming dust motes in the quiet air. The shed was warm, filled with the honest scent of oil and steel. He finished his task. The tools were clean, sharp, and glistening with a thin, protective layer of oil, arranged neatly on the workbench. They were ready for the next day's labor, rested and renewed instruments of peace. He stood and stretched, feeling the gentle stiffness of a focused afternoon. The bell would ring soon, calling him to vespers, the final transition of the day. The preparation was complete. The instruments were ready. The long, golden light of the afternoon softened, yielding to the beautiful, brief intensity of twilight. Brother Elias left the tool shed, the metallic scent of oil and sharp steel clinging to his heavy habit. His heart felt a deep sense of order, the quiet satisfaction that comes from having put things right. The tools were protected, the instruments of service clean and ready. The Abbey bell began its slow, resonant toll for vespers. The sound, carried on the cooling air, was a gentle invitation to lay down the burden of the day and turn toward the enduring light. Elias entered the chapel. The interior was now a place of soft shadows and deep colors, the light failing rapidly outside the high windows. The brothers took their places, their forms indistinct in the gathering gloom, a quiet community focused on gratitude and surrender. The Vesper service was a slow, deliberate act of letting go. Elias allowed his mind to follow the gentle, familiar cadence of the Psalms, releasing the sharp focus of the afternoon's labor. He thought of the tools, now resting, no longer demanding his attention. The spirit, too, required this rest, the surrender of the will that strives and controls. The hymn of the evening spoke of peace descending upon the house, a blessing of quietude over the dwelling and its inhabitants. Grant us, O Lord, the blessed peace, that from all worldly toil release, and let your holy, guiding light be with us through the coming night. Elias sang the words softly, feeling the promise of peace settle over him like the cool, soft evening air. Peace, he knew, was not the absence of trouble, but the presence of trust. As the final light disappeared, the chapel was illuminated solely by the oil lamps. Elias fixed his gaze on the sanctuary lamp, its small red glow a steady, unblinking eye in the darkness. It was the perpetual light, the simple, constant proof that even when the sun departed, the divine presence remained, warm and vigilant. After the service, Elias moved slowly through the cloister. The stars were beginning to emerge in the dark expanse above the courtyard, cold and distant, yet beautiful in their silent order. He stopped by the angel fountain, listening to the continuous, soft drip, whisper, peace of the water. He thought of the three forms of preservation he had tended today: the herbs, dried to concentrate their essence; the tools, oiled to prevent corrosion; and the soul, quieted by prayer to preserve its trust. All were necessary acts of faith in the long-term, unseen future. He made his way to his cell for the final surrender of Compline. He knelt briefly by his cot, offering his last conscious prayer, a thanks for the work accomplished and a request for the protection of the sleeping Abbey. He rose and went to the window, observing the deep, clear night. He climbed into the cot, pulling the rough blanket over him. The cold air pressed against the window, but the blanket was warm and comforting. Elias focused on the silence. He was descending now into the deep, internal quiet, letting his thoughts detach one by one. The image of the shining, oiled tools faded. The memory of the aromatic drying shed dissolved. All that remained was the consciousness of being held, safe in the stillness, nestled between the cold stone and the warm wool. He began the final, slow, deliberate process of breathing himself into rest. Inhale, receive. Exhale, release. He felt the deep, restorative darkness gather around him, a velvety blanket of rest. The work was done, the vigil was kept, and the assurance of the coming dawn was absolute. Brother Elias settled into the enduring peace, held fast by the silent, faithful rhythm of the night. Brother Elias woke to the profound silence of a clear, cold morning. The darkness had been complete, and the rest deep. He rose, feeling the equilibrium of the night settled throughout his body, the sense of readiness that comes from having no unconfessed anxiety, and no unfulfilled debt to the day before. The matins bell rang, sharp and bright, a beacon of sound in the cold, thin air. In the chapel, the atmosphere was one of solemn vigilance. The lessons today focused on the theme of wisdom, the understanding that true knowledge is not found in complexity, but in simplicity and obedience. Elias, standing in his place, felt the weight of the ancient words, recognizing them as the source of the order and peace he sought to maintain in the physical world of the garden. The service concluded, and Elias prepared to head for his outdoor labor, the early inspection of the lettuce beds, when he was gently intercepted by Father Abbot Michael. The abbot spoke in a low, respectful voice, a rare moment of direct conversation outside of the service. "Brother Elias, the morning is bright, but the air is too sharp for the immediate work. Brother Peter is struggling to finish the transcription of the Gospel of John before the noon light shifts. Would you lend your steady hand to the scriptorium for the morning? The ink requires constant, careful mixing." Elias bowed his head in quiet acceptance. This was an unusual request. His days were almost always governed by the earth, but the Abbey's needs were paramount. To work in the scriptorium was a different kind of labor, equally focused, equally reverent. He followed the abbot to the scriptorium, a long room on the second floor with a southern exposure, designed to capture the best light of the day. As he entered, the world seemed to shift from the earthy smells of soil and salt to the clean, sharp scent of parchment, iron gall ink, and aged wood. The scriptorium was a sanctuary of silence. Four other brothers sat at sloping wooden desks, their backs straight, their hands moving with agonizing slowness and precision. The only sound was the soft, continuous scratching of quills on vellum, a sound like dry insects working patiently on wood, and the gentle rustle of turning pages. Brother Peter, his shoulders tense, was bent over a large, illuminated page. His task was monumental, copying the sacred text by hand, ensuring every line was perfectly straight, every letter formed with deliberate piety. Elias's job was simple, but vital. He moved to the central table where the ink pots were kept. The natural ink, made from iron salts and vegetable matter, required occasional, gentle stirring to prevent the pigment from settling and to maintain a consistent flow for the quills. If the ink was too thick, it clogged the quill. If too thin, it bled into the vellum. Elias took up a small, smooth glass rod and began to stir the deep, black ink in the small clay pot. His movements were slow, smooth, and utterly rhythmic. "Stir, wait," observe. He watched the way the dark, viscous fluid swirled, revealing a hidden, shimmering light beneath the surface. As he worked, he reflected on the profound connection between the garden and the scroll. He was the keeper of the seed, and the brothers around him were the keepers of the word. The seed was a living container of life, hidden in the darkness of the earth, waiting to be revealed in the light. The word was a spiritual container of truth, hidden on the dark page, waiting to be revealed by the eye and the spirit. Both required the same patient discipline, clear ground, or clean vellum, pure substance, or correct ink, and gentle handling. He thought of the words Brother Peter was currently transcribing. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The Word was the creative source, the blueprint of the universe. The simple seed in Elias's hand was merely a physical manifestation of that word, an echo of the original divine intention. The labor was the same, the patient attention to detail, the trust in the hidden potential, the faith that the small, dark thing would yield a glorious, sustained light. Elias continued stirring, the movement of his wrists small and constant. The sunlight streaming through the window was clear and bright, providing perfect illumination for the arduous work. The silence of the scriptorium was rich and holy, a place where the human spirit worked in direct, quiet communion with the eternal source of all order and life. He spent the long hours until noon in this simple, vital task, maintaining the perfect flow of the sacred black fluid. It was a morning spent tending a different kind of garden, a garden of thought, word, and unwavering illumination. The morning's labor in the scriptorium concluded with the midday bell. Brother Elias finished stirring the ink for the final time, ensuring the consistency was perfect for Brother Peter to continue his painstaking work through the early afternoon. He quietly placed the glass rod back on the table and, with a silent bow toward the working scribes, left the room. The transition from the world of the Word to the world of the earth was jarring, yet profoundly insightful. He walked through the midday sun, now fully risen, feeling the cold air outside the scriptorium walls against the warmth he had gained inside. The meal in the refectory was, as always, a lesson in simplicity and gratitude. The reader continued with passages related to the precision required for following divine law, the need for accurate measure and dedicated observance. Elias listened, his mind connecting the measured lines of the scroll to the measured rows of the vegetable beds. He ate the soup slowly, savoring the simple, comforting warmth. His hands, which had spent the morning maintaining the flow of ink, now rested open on the table, still carrying the faint, metallic scent of iron gall. After the brief rest, Elias finally retrieved his heavy boots and prepared for the afternoon's work in the garden. The sun had begun its long, slow arc toward the west, casting a steady, warm light. The cold air had finally retreated, replaced by a softer, still air that held the scent of pine and dry earth. His planned task was meticulous, the final bedding down of the youngest winter cabbages. This required creating a small, protective ring of dry straw and loose soil around the base of each fragile head, protecting them from the sudden, sharp frosts that could descend at night. Elias knelt down at the edge of the first cabbage patch. The task demanded the same focus and precision he had exercised in the scriptorium. If the straw was packed too tightly, it would hold moisture and promote rot. If it was too sparse, it would offer no insulation. The act was one of delicate balance. He took up a handful of dry, pale straw, feeling its light, brittle texture against his palms. He began to arrange it around the first cabbage head, creating a small, low collar. He used his fingers, working slowly, gently tucking the straw against the base of the stem. Measure, place, secure. The physical rhythm of the garden had absorbed the mental rhythm of the scriptorium. Elias realized that the stillness he had achieved while watching the black ink swirl was now sustaining the stillness required to protect the young green life. The quality of his inner state, cultivated by hours of simple, focused attention, had transferred directly to the quality of his work in the soil. The careful, rhythmic movement of the glass rod in the inkwell was mirrored in the gentle, circular movement of his hands around the cabbage stem. He thought of the words of the gospel Brother Peter had been transcribing, the eternal, divine word made visible and tangible. His work was also about making the intangible, love, patience, and order, tangible through physical labor. The protective collar around the cabbage was not just straw, it was an act of faith, a visible sign of hopeful stewardship. The only sounds were the soft, dry rustle of the straw and the distant, constant murmur of the sea. Elias worked his way down the long rows, his body bent, his spirit quiet and fully present. The sun continued to descend, casting the long, elegant shadows of the cypress trees across the garden. The air began to cool subtly, reminding him of the importance of the work he was doing, preparing the vulnerable life for the inevitable return of the cold. As he finished the last cabbage, his muscles were tired, but his heart was at rest. He stood back and surveyed the long, orderly rows, each small green head protected by its pale, dry collar of straw. It was a beautiful sight of ordered patience. He returned his tools to the shed, his mind settled and clear. The Abbey bell would soon toll for vespers, calling him to prayer, but he knew the prayer had already been completed in the silent, meticulous work of the afternoon. The Abbey bell began its deep, solemn call for vespers, pulling Brother Elias from the stillness of the garden toward the sanctuary. The air was now sharply cold, carrying the unmistakable scent of approaching night and the dry, sweet fragrance of the straw he had placed around the cabbages. He entered the chapel. The atmosphere was one of profound peace, the last light of the day, a pale, serene gold, filtering through the western windows. The brothers gathered, their forms quiet and still, offering their final collective prayer before the long night. Elias listened as the psalms were chanted, focusing on the theme of protection and the certainty of the divine watchfulness over those who labor in faith. He thought of the small cabbage heads, tucked safely into their beds of straw, vulnerable yet secure. The prayer was the final collar of protection, wrapping the Abbey and its inhabitants in a similar assurance. The Vesper hymn tonight was ancient, a quiet psalm of thanksgiving for the gifts of light and rest. O fountain of all light and grace, your mercy fills this holy place. We thank you for the work we've done, and pray your peace when day is run. The music, simple and slow, was designed to lull the spirit into submission and rest. Elias felt the tightness in his shoulders and hands, the physical residue of the day's work, the stirring of the ink, the careful placement of the straw, begin to dissolve under the gentle weight of the prayer. As the service drew to a close, the final sliver of light vanished, and the chapel relied solely on the glow of the sanctuary lamp. Elias felt the familiar, beautiful transition from the visible world of effort to the invisible world of trust. He moved silently with the other brothers to the refectory for a brief, final drink of cold spring water and a small piece of bread. This final, silent sustenance was a preparation not just for the body, but for the soul, ensuring that the last moments before sleep were simple and untroubled. Following this, he walked the long, silent corridor back to his cell. He prepared for Compline, the prayer of surrender. He knelt by his cot, his hands resting on the cold floorboards. His final thoughts were of the garden, the seeds safe in their jar, the tools oiled, the cabbages protected. His work was not heroic, but it was complete. He had been a faithful steward of the small corner of creation entrusted to his care. He climbed into his cot, pulling the heavy blanket close. The darkness was absolute, deep and restorative. He lay on his back, allowing his body to sink into the mattress, releasing any last residual tension from his arms and back. Elias focused on his breathing, slowing the rhythm until it was barely perceptible. He heard no sounds now, save the faint, inner pulse of his own life. He thought of the great, quiet truths of the world, that the seed must rest in darkness to grow, that the sun always returns, and that the simplest work, done with fidelity and peace, is the surest path to rest. Sleep descended upon Brother Elias then, a soft, profound quietude, a gentle folding of the spirit into the enduring peace of the night. The night's deep peace yielded to a morning of startling clarity. Brother Elias woke at the hour of vigils, before the bell, feeling the subtle, pleasant cold of the pre-dawn air. As he lay in the darkness, waiting for the first toll, he noticed a new sound that settled softly beneath the familiar rhythm of the distant sea. It was a very faint, almost imperceptible sound, the careful, quiet tap, tap, tap of a hammer against stone. It was irregular, hushed, and completely unlike the Abbey's usual sounds of work. No rhythmic chop of wood, no kitchen clatter, just the quiet shaping of rock. The matins bell rang, sharp and clear, momentarily silencing the sound. Elias rose and moved to the chapel, his mind curious but calm. In the chapel, the atmosphere was slightly different. At the end of the line of seated brothers, there was a new figure, a man in a simple, rough-spun brown tunic, whose posture was straight and still. He was clearly a guest, observing the prayer with quiet reverence. After the service, the abbot offered a brief, low-voiced introduction. "Brothers, this is Brother Julian. He is a traveling craftsman and stonemason, resting with us for a few weeks. He has offered his skill to replace some of the older, worn flagstones in the cloister courtyard." Elias nodded a silent greeting to Brother Julian, a man whose hands looked as gnarled and powerful as his own, yet whose movements possessed the quiet grace of a lifetime spent in patient, solitary labor. Elias then went to the garden. The air was crisp and cold, but the sun was ascending swiftly. Today, his morning task was simple clearing, removing the final withered stalks of last season's beans, preparing the ground for the turning. As he worked, kneeling on the cold soil, he became aware again of the sound of Brother Julian. The stonemason was working in the cloister courtyard, just beyond the high garden wall. The sound of the hammer was steady but soft, a quiet chink as he dressed the stones, shaping their rough edges for a perfect fit. Elias listened, finding the rhythm deeply soothing. It was a sound of persistence, of gentle force, of taking the raw, uneven material and finding the hidden plane of order within it. He realized the mason's work was identical to his own, merely applied to a different material. Elias worked with the living, yielding earth, clearing the weeds and ordering the growth. Julian worked with the dead, enduring stone, clearing the rough edges and ordering the boundaries. Both were acts of establishing peace and stability. Elias thought of the gospel words. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The work of the stonemason was a constant meditation on this transformation, taking the rejected, irregular piece of rock and through patient, rhythmic effort, making it essential, making it a perfect, foundational part of the whole. Elias spent the morning clearing the dead stalks, stacking them neatly for the composting fire. He worked slowly, deliberately, matching his own pace to the rhythm of the distant chink, chink, chink of the hammer. The sound was a comforting presence, a reminder that throughout the Abbey, the quiet, disciplined work of mending, ordering, and preparing was continuous. He stopped his work only when the bell rang for the midday office. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand and smiled faintly. Today, his work in the garden was seasoned by the sound of another's devotion to the quiet art of fitting things perfectly together. The midday bell for the office of none called Brother Elias from his meditative labor in the garden. He walked toward the Abbey, the smell of dark, turned soil fading beneath the stronger, sharp scent of limestone dust carried on the breeze from the cloister. He entered the refectory, where the brothers were already taking their places. The midday meal was a hearty vegetable soup, made thick with split peas and root vegetables, and served with generous slabs of the Abbey's crusty bread. The silence of the meal was interspersed with the low, steady voice of the reader, who spoke today of the parable of the talents, the command to be productive, to invest the gifts given, and to avoid burying one's potential. Elias listened, thinking of the seeds buried not out of fear, but out of patient trust, and the stones shaped not in haste, but in patient service. He finished his meal and, after the blessing, went to retrieve his small cloak before his rest. As he passed the cloister, he saw Brother Julian, the stonemason, kneeling beside his workspace. Julian had spread a thick piece of canvas on the stone pavement to contain the dust, and he was carefully cleaning his tools, a heavy mallet, a specialized chisel, and a small, delicate hammer. Elias paused, watching the mason's hands. They were large and powerful, but moved with a surprising tenderness over the steel blades. The mason looked up, sensing Elias's presence, and offered a quiet, respectful nod. "A good day for setting stone, brother," Elias murmured, his voice gentle. "And a good day for clearing the ground, Brother Elias," Julian replied, his voice deep and measured. "There is a patience to the stone that is harder to find than the patience of the plant." Elias smiled. "The stone teaches me permanence. The plant teaches me surrender. I spent the morning clearing the old, dead vines. They surrendered their hold easily, knowing their work was done." Julian rubbed a drop of oil onto the tip of a fine chisel. "The stone does not surrender. It must be persuaded. You must listen to its grain, find its hidden line of weakness, and tap with respect. If you force it, it breaks badly. You must work with what is there, not what you wish was there." Elias felt a profound resonance in the mason's words. It was the same lesson the garden taught him every season, the necessity of observing the truth of the soil, its limits, its composition, its needs, rather than imposing his own impatient will upon it. "You seek the cornerstone," Elias said, quietly referencing the gospel passage he had thought of earlier. "We seek the fit," Julian corrected gently. "The purpose of the individual stone is to lie quietly and perfectly beside its neighbor, creating a foundation that can hold the weight of the Abbey. No stone calls attention to itself. The strength is in the unity." Elias looked down at the freshly dressed flagstones lying near the canvas. They were imperfectly rectangular, each possessing a unique character, yet all shaped to lie flush with one another. It was a beautiful lesson in community, each soul, unique and rough, shaped by discipline to support the whole structure of faith. He stood for a moment longer in quiet contemplation, allowing the metaphor of the stone and the community to settle in his heart. The simple, nonverbal exchange felt more nourishing than any formal conversation. "May the Lord grant you strength for your fitting, brother," Elias said. "And you for your planting, Brother Elias," Julian replied. Elias walked on to his cell for the hour of rest. The exchange had deepened his rest, filling his mind not with the demands of his own work, but with the quiet dignity of Julian's discipline. He lay down on his cot, the gentle chink, chink, chink of the hammer from the cloister acting as a steady, quiet metronome to his repose. He felt held between the two disciplines, the yielding earth and the enduring stone, both requiring patience, both yielding peace. The hour of rest was concluded by the gentle, fading echo of the stonemason's hammer, signaling Brother Julian's return to his labor in the cloister. Brother Elias rose, feeling the stillness of the Merides' rest complete, but his mind was now intensely focused on the concept of unity and fit, the lessons learned from the stone. He returned to the garden for the afternoon's work. His task was to repair a section of the main path that ran between the fruit trees and the herb beds. Here, the heavy rains of the previous weeks had loosened the flagstones, creating an uneven and potentially dangerous passage. The Abbey garden needed not only growth but stability, a safe route for passage. Elias knelt beside the damaged section. The stones were large, unevenly shaped pieces of cliff shale, and they had shifted so that one edge of a stone was raised, threatening to trip a hurried foot, while the opposite side had sunk into the muddy earth. He began by gently lifting the shifted stones. They were surprisingly heavy, dense with years of absorbed moisture and earth. He set them aside and then worked the underlying earth, a wet, heavy clay, using his small trowel to level the ground. The labor was meticulous and required the exact patience Brother Julian had spoken of. He wasn't trying to force the stone into a perfect rectangular hole. He was trying to shape the earth to honor the unique, uneven bottom surface of the stone. He was working with what was there. Elias spread a thin layer of sharp, dry sand, stored in the garden shed specifically for this purpose, over the clay. The sand acted as the gentle, yielding buffer, the equivalent of Julian's mortar, allowing the stone to find its resting place without friction. He then took the first large stone. He lifted it with a grunt, feeling the solid, unforgiving weight, and lowered it carefully into the prepared bed of sand. Now came the test of the fit. Elias stood over the stone, placing his weight evenly on the surface, rocking it gently. If it rocked, the fit was wrong. He lifted the stone again, added a small, almost imperceptible amount of sand beneath the low side, and set it down once more. Tap, rock, observe. He repeated this patient process until the stone lay perfectly flat, stable, and still. The feeling of the stone settling into its final, quiet repose was profoundly satisfying, a small, physical triumph of order over chaos. As he worked, he thought of Julian's words. The purpose of the individual stone is to lie quietly and perfectly beside its neighbor, creating a foundation that can hold the weight of the Abbey. Elias realized that the path itself was a metaphor for the discipline of faith. It was not a grand road, but a series of small, stable, secure steps. Each stone had to be laid right, one after the other, not for its own glory, but so that the foot could pass safely, focusing on the destination rather than the footing. He worked his way down the path, repairing stone after stone, creating a stable, continuous surface. The sun was now fully in the west, and the long, thin shadow of the cypress trees stretched across his work, marking the steady passage of the afternoon. The only sounds were the soft thump of the stones settling into the sand and the rhythmic shush of the smoothing trowel. The gentle, distant chink of Julian's hammer from the cloister provided a quiet, parallel soundtrack, a constant reminder that the work of stability was happening simultaneously across the Abbey grounds. When the bell rang for vespers, Elias had completed the repair. He stood at the head of the path, looking down the long, stable line of the newly laid stones. They were secure, unified, and quiet. He washed his hands at the fountain basin, scrubbing away the sand and clay. He felt the quiet exhaustion of a difficult, focused labor. His day had been a beautiful balance, the stillness of the word in the morning, the profound stillness of the stone at noon, and the patient stillness of the earth in the afternoon. All labors, unified by attention, had yielded peace. The Vespers service had concluded, filling Brother Elias with the quiet assurance that the day's labors, the intellectual focus of the word, the physical balance of the stone, and the patient yield of the earth, were accepted. He walked back to his cell for the final hours, the feeling of the smooth, newly laid stones beneath his sandals a constant, quiet pleasure. The path was secure. The Abbey was sinking into its final period of silence. Elias took his place for Compline, the last gathering of the day. The chapel was deep in shadow, relying entirely on the gentle, steady glow of the oil lamps. The service was short, a final act of relinquishment and trust. The abbot's voice, a soft, weary murmur, began the reading. "The Lord Almighty grant us a quiet night and a perfect end." Elias surrendered the last lingering concerns. He mentally released the pressure of the clay soil, the sharp edges of the cliff shale, and the meticulous attention demanded by the scriptorium. His prayer was simple: gratitude for the day's lesson, that true strength is found not in individual effort, but in the perfect fit of one part to the whole. The psalm chosen for the evening reinforced this theme of foundation and security. "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." Elias recognized the secret place as the quiet of his own heart, and the shadow as the pervasive, gentle protection of God's providence. He understood now that the security Julian had built into the cloister stones, and he himself into the garden path, was a physical reflection of this spiritual truth. The Abbey endured not because of its height or its walls, but because its foundations were quietly and consistently maintained by small, patient acts of devotion. After the final blessing, Elias walked to his cell. He went to the window and looked out into the deep night. The moon had risen, bathing the garden in a soft, silver light that smoothed over the rough textures and sharp edges, making the landscape serene and ethereal. He could see the dark, orderly line of the repaired path, a quiet testament to the afternoon's work. He knelt by his cot, offering his final, wordless prayer. He thanked Providence for the simple, clear discipline of the day, for the word that guided, the stone that stabilized, and the earth that yielded. He climbed into his cot and pulled the coarse wool blanket over him. The cold was a distant presence, held at bay by the warmth of the covering and the inner peace of a clean conscience. Elias focused on the silence. It was not an empty silence, but a profound, dense quiet, filled with the presence of sleeping life. The brothers resting in their cells, the seeds waiting in the dark jars, the cabbages protected by their straw collars, and the newly laid stones resting quietly in the sand. All things were in their proper place, settled into the order of the night. He closed his eyes and felt the deep, restorative darkness envelop him. His breathing slowed, becoming shallow and measured. The last thought to cross his mind was of the entire Abbey, a vast, stone vessel, floating safely on the cliff edge, held steady by the quiet foundation of shared faith and simple, patient labor. He drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, enveloped in the enduring peace of a life lived in harmony with the rhythm of grace and earth. Brother Elias woke to a morning of deep, crystalline silence, the kind of quiet that follows a profound, restorative sleep. He felt the quiet foundation, laid by the patient work of the previous day, holding him steady. The matins bell, when it rang, was a clear, sharp sound cutting through the cold air. The service in the chapel was simple and focused. The psalms of the morning spoke of light and truth, of God as the source of all illumination, both spiritual and physical. Elias listened with heightened attention, knowing that today his hands would be directly involved in this very discipline. After the blessing, Elias moved immediately to his morning's unique task, the tending of the Abbey's lamps. This was a duty separate from his garden work, yet equally vital and deeply symbolic. The lamps, the sanctuary lamp, the oil lamps in the refectory and the scriptorium, and the small brass lanterns used for nighttime travel, were the physical bearers of light, and their performance depended entirely on meticulous, quiet care. He began in the small, stone-lined lamp room, a cool, dark space adjacent to the kitchen, smelling faintly of clean olive oil and spent wick. His tools were simple: a small pair of trimming shears, a roll of fine cotton wicking, and a clean leather cloth. He started with the most sacred of all, the sanctuary lamp. This small, red glass vessel burned constantly before the altar, holding the most precious, purest oil. Elias approached it with reverence, carrying a small ladder. He ascended slowly, carefully bringing the lamp down to the worktable. The oil inside was still high, but the wick had carbonized at the tip, its burning surface uneven. He gently trimmed the black, spent portion of the wick with his shears, leaving a clean, perfectly symmetrical curve of cotton. This was the moment of purification, removing the burnt waste that impeded the flow of fuel to the flame. Elias thought of this as the essential spiritual task, the necessity of daily trimming, removing the char of yesterday's sins and distractions, so that the divine oil, grace, could be drawn up and consumed cleanly, without smoke or sputtering. The quality of the light depended on the fidelity of the trimmer. He refilled the lamp with a slow, deliberate stream of fresh, clear olive oil, sourced from the ancient tree in the garden. The oil was thick, cool, and clean, pooling over the old oil, ensuring a full reservoir. The oil, he mused, was the fuel of life, the energy of the earth, and the sustaining power of faith. It was a visible resource that required constant replenishment. Next, he moved to the common lamps, the heavy, iron-based oil lamps used in the main halls. These required more effort. Their wicks were thicker, and the oil, being cheaper, often left more residue. He cleaned the glass shades, removing the soot and dust that dulled their illumination. The glass shades were the windows of the lamp, and they needed to be crystal clear so that the light within could truly shine out into the world. He thought of the glass shades as the human heart, designed to transmit the light of faith. If the heart was clouded by worry, resentment, or preoccupation, the light remained trapped, dulled by the external grime. The cleaning was the practice of repentance and forgiveness, wiping away the dust of the world to allow the inner illumination to be shared. Elias worked in the cool, quiet room for the entire morning. The rhythmic sound of the trimming shears and the gentle clink of the glass shades being cleaned created a quiet, soothing soundtrack to his labor. When he finished, all the wicks were trimmed, all the reservoirs were full, and all the glass shades were spotless. The brass of the lanterns gleamed faintly in the dim light of the lamp room. He carried the sanctuary lamp back to the altar. As he lit the fresh wick, a clean, steady, vibrant flame sprang forth, burning with a pure, quiet intensity. He hung the lamp back in its position before the altar, a perfect, unwavering point of light. Elias stood back, feeling the quiet satisfaction of the discipline. The light was ready for the day and the night ahead. His morning's labor had been a dedication to the principle that true illumination requires constant, quiet attention to the inner workings, to the wick and the oil, to ensure that the promise of light is faithfully fulfilled. The midday bell chimed, drawing Brother Elias from the cool, fragrant lamp room to the refectory. The hour of the midday meal, the office of none, was a necessary reset, pulling his focus from the internal mechanics of light back to the external necessity of sustenance. The meal was simple, a thick soup of dried beans and potatoes, served with water and bread. The reader's voice, steady and rhythmic, spoke of the necessity of good deeds, of works that are seen and glorify the Father. Elias listened, thinking not of grand, spectacular deeds, but of the quiet, visible acts he had just performed, the perfectly trimmed wick, the spotless glass shade. These small, meticulous actions, he realized, were the very definition of a well-tended life. After the restorative silence of the Merides' rest, Elias prepared to return to the earth, carrying the lessons of the lamp room with him. The sun was now descending, casting its long, warm light over the garden. His task for the afternoon was the final loosening of the soil in the oldest, largest vegetable plot, preparing it for a deep layer of winter mulch. This was heavy, steady work with a large, two-tined digging fork, requiring sustained, rhythmic strength. Elias walked out to the plot. He took up the fork, feeling the familiar, smooth weight of the wooden handle in his hands. He positioned the tines at the edge of the hard-packed earth. Plunge, rock, lift, turn. The work was slow, deliberate, and deeply grounding. He plunged the fork deep into the soil with the weight of his body, levered the handle to break the earth, and then turned the heavy mass over, exposing the dark, cool, rich undersurface to the light. The earth yielded with a soft, tearing sound, a sound of gentle, necessary submission. As he worked, he consciously connected this physical labor to his spiritual lessons from the morning. He thought of the soil itself as the great, constant reservoir of oil, the raw fuel of life. His work was not to create the oil, but to make the earth permeable, to loosen the hard-packed crust so that the hidden nourishment could be drawn up. The compaction of the soil, the hardness that resisted the fork, was like the spent wick, the accumulated pressure and resistance built up by years of neglect or heavy use. His digging was the trimming, the removal of the hard resistance to allow the soil to breathe, to allow the unseen forces of water and nutrient to flow freely. He continued his rhythmic digging, moving backward across the plot, leaving behind him a trail of dark, freshly turned, fragrant earth. The sun beat down, warming the exposed soil, which released a deep, satisfying, earthy scent into the air. Plunge, rock, lift, turn. The rhythm was hypnotic, clearing his mind completely of all external noise and internal chatter. The sound of the fork against the stone, the slight clink as he unearthed a buried pebble, was instantly absorbed into the deep, quiet flow of the work. He worked until his arms ached with a pleasant, profound exhaustion. The plot was entirely turned, the soil loose, dark, and ready to receive the insulating mulch. He stood back, admiring the texture of the newly broken earth. The setting sun cast the long shadows of the Abbey buildings across the turned field, creating a striking pattern of light and dark. Elias saw the field not merely as earth, but as a great, open glass shade, now clean and ready to receive and reflect the final blessing of the sun. The soil, now loosened and aerated, was fully prepared for the quiet work of the night. Elias leaned on the handle of his fork. The heavy tool felt like an extension of his own body, an instrument of peace and order. The day, illuminated by the discipline of the lamp and grounded by the honesty of the soil, was nearing its end. The evening bell for vespers would call him soon, inviting him to surrender the day's labor and embrace the quiet reward of the night. The vespers bell had tolled, and Brother Elias had offered his evening prayer, releasing the day's hard work into the hands of Providence. The sun had set, and the twilight was rapidly deepening into the cool, still blue of the night. His final, most significant task remained, spreading the mulch over the freshly turned earth. He walked to the far end of the garden where the large, aged compost heap stood. It was a mound of dark, rich material, decomposed leaves, spent stalks, wood ash, and kitchen scraps, all transformed by the slow, quiet alchemy of time and decay into fertile, life-giving matter. The mulch smelled sweet, earthy, and immensely comforting. Elias took up a wide, wooden shovel, feeling its light, balanced weight. His movement was slow, a deliberate arc of his arms as he scooped the mulch and carried it to the large, turned plot. He began at the top edge of the field. His motion was now one of scattering, not digging. He walked slowly backward over the freshly broken soil, tossing the dark, light material in wide, gentle sweeps. He aimed for an even, insulating blanket, thick enough to protect the light beneath, but not so heavy as to smother it. The sound of the mulch falling onto the loose earth was soft and satisfying, a continuous, whispering shush-shush, a sound of final, quiet covering. Elias thought of the spiritual significance of this act. The mulch was the covering, a protective layer placed over the vulnerability of the deep work. He was protecting the newly loosened soil from the harshness of the coming winter cold, and from the wind that could dry out the essential moisture. It was an act of faith in the hidden life. The entire plot, which had been exposed and raw after the turning, slowly disappeared beneath the dark, soft blanket. This act was the ultimate surrender of the harvest to the unseen forces of the earth. He was trusting that the cold would not destroy the soil, but rather purify it, that the decaying mulch would not choke the life, but nourish it over the long, silent months. He thought of the words of the psalm he often recited. Thou makest darkness, and it is night, wherein all the beasts of the forest do creep forth. The darkness and the covering were not a void, but a fertile time of secret activity, of rest and silent transformation. The mulch was the Abbey's final, physical prayer for that quiet transformation. As he worked, the darkness intensified. The outline of the Abbey against the sky became sharper, its walls a deep, reassuring mass of permanence. Elias worked by the faint, silvery light of the rising moon, relying on the feeling of the mulch on the shovel and the sound of its descent to ensure even coverage. When the last of the mulch was spread, Elias leaned on his shovel. The entire plot was transformed from a field of dark furrows into a uniform, soft, welcoming surface. The work was complete. The earth had been prepared, turned, and now covered for its long, necessary sleep. He returned his tools to the shed. The night was now fully upon the garden, cold and still. He moved toward the cloister for the final prayer of Compline, feeling a deep, quiet sense of rest pervade his soul. The labor of the earth was finished, and the vigil of the spirit was about to begin. He lay down in his cot moments later, pulling the heavy wool blanket close. He felt the weight of the dark earth and the soft covering of the mulch outside his window, a palpable presence of peace and security. He knew the garden was safe, released from his effort, entrusted to the faithful providence of the night. And in that quiet certainty, Brother Elias drifted into the profound, dreamless sleep of the keeper of the quiet garden. The Abbey woke to a morning of startling, quiet beauty. The cold had purified the air, and the sun rose over the cliffs with a magnificent, clear light. Brother Elias, having enjoyed the deep rest afforded by the mulched and covered earth, rose feeling renewed and keenly alert. The matin service was robust and steady, a collective affirmation of constancy in the face of change. The morning's readings spoke of sacrifice and the necessity of cutting away the superfluous to preserve the essential, a theme that spoke directly to Elias's planned labor. After the service, Elias headed immediately to the small, sheltered corner near the southern wall, the quiet place where the Abbey's oldest and most prized rose bushes grew. These were not the showy, modern varieties, but ancient, hardy climbers, their canes thick and woody, their blooms simple, fragrant, and deeply rooted in the Abbey's history. His task today was pruning, the quiet, precise violence necessary to ensure the health and fertility of the next season. He carried only his heavy, well-oiled shears, which were clean and sharp from the previous day's maintenance, and a pair of thick leather gloves. He stood before the largest climber, whose gnarled, gray-brown canes spiraled nearly to the top of the wall. The rose bush, in its winter state, looked chaotic and still, its leaves fallen, its structure a dense tangle of old, woody growth and thin, spindly shoots. Elias began his work slowly, examining the cane structure with the patient eye of one who understood the plant's history. He focused on identifying 3 types of growth that had to be removed: the deadwood, which was gray and brittle, the crossing canes, which rubbed and damaged healthy wood, and the spindly growth, which was too thin to bear a strong flower or survive the winter. He took his shears. The first cut was on a thick, dead cane, a solid piece of gray wood that had ceased to live. Snick! The sound was sharp and clean, a declaration of removal. He cut the cane close to the base, removing the dead weight that served only to harbor disease and consume space. The pruning was a profound act of spiritual contemplation for Elias. It was a physical enactment of the gospel lesson. Every branch that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that continues to bear fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. The goal of the pruning was not to diminish the rose, but to enable its true purpose, to produce more and finer flowers. The plant needed the removal of the old and the weak so that the energy, the limited oil of the plant, could flow entirely to the strongest, most promising new growth. It was an act of mercy through reduction. Elias worked with great concentration, his gloved hands navigating the dense tangle, searching for the small, dormant bud, the eye, that pointed outward, toward the sun and the air. He made each cut at an angle, just above this dormant bud, ensuring the rain would run off and the new light would be correctly directed. The rhythm of the work was slow and methodical. Examine, choose, cut, release. The fallen canes gathered at his feet, forming a pile of discarded potential and spent life. He felt no regret over the removal. The shears were instruments of necessity, not destruction. He was clearing the way for the coming season of grace. The sun climbed higher, warming the cold stone wall. The air was filled with the faint, sharp scent of cut wood and crushed rose thorns. Elias felt his mind settling deeper into the tranquility of the task, his breathing matching the pace of the shears. He spent the entire morning focused on this quiet violence, transforming the chaotic tangle into a clean, disciplined form. When the midday bell chimed, the rose bush looked stark, smaller, and radically simplified, but its remaining canes were strong, poised, and pointed directly toward the light, ready to receive the spring's renewal. The midday bell had called Brother Elias from his pruning, leaving the garden air thick with the sharp scent of cutwood and essential oils released from the rose canes. He felt a deep, cleansing weariness, the exhaustion that follows an act of necessary sacrifice and concentrated effort. He returned to the refectory for the noon meal. The silence of the hall was a welcome balm to the intensity of the morning's labor. The food was simple: roasted root vegetables dug from the outer beds, warm and earthy, served with the Abbey's dense, dark bread. The reader's voice, steady and calm, spoke of the necessity of spiritual pruning, the discipline required to remove worldly attachments, so that the soul could bear the fruit of true devotion. Elias ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the vegetables, which tasted of the cold earth and the patient heat of the oven. The meal was a physical parallel to his morning's work, a consumption of the enduring, essential nourishment, stripped of any excess. After the meal, Elias retreated to his cell for the Merides' rest. He lay on his cot, and the day's work surfaced in his mind, the image of the massive pile of discarded rose canes, the deadwood, and the spindly growth now lying outside the garden wall, waiting to be reduced to ash. He reflected on the profound meaning of the sacrifice. The rose bush, now stark and simplified, looked diminished, yet its true life force was more concentrated, focused, and secure. He realized that this was the most challenging lesson of the Christian life, that the greatest increase comes only through the most deliberate decrease. The things he feared losing, time, energy, comfort, were often the very things that needed to be pruned away so that the essential faith could thrive. He thought of the words of the gospel on the page of the scriptorium. If it dies, it produces much fruit. He saw the rose bush as a temporary, willing participant in this daily spiritual law of death and resurrection. The pruning was its burial, its surrender to the promise of spring. The deep silence of the afternoon settled around him, profound and undisturbed. Elias allowed his mind to sink beneath the surface of these thoughts, moving toward the threshold of sleep. He let the image of the bare, waiting rose and the pile of surrendered wood fade, focusing instead on the constant, unwavering presence he had felt in the chapel. The bell for Vespers eventually called him from this quiet repose. He moved with a new lightness toward the chapel, feeling the internal order restored. Vespers was a gentle hymn of gratitude for the light. As the sun disappeared, Elias felt the work of the day, the quiet violence of the shears, finally balanced by the assurance of providence. He went through the final steps of the evening, the silent gathering for Compline, the prayer of surrender, and the walk back to his cell under the clear, cold gaze of the stars. He lay down in his cot, pulling the heavy blanket around him. His last memory was of the patient rose, pruned and waiting, facing the darkness with quiet confidence. He felt himself settling, his body heavy and still, into the deep, restorative dark. He knew that the Abbey was safe, and the garden was prepared. In that certainty, Brother Elias entered the profound, peaceful sleep of the keeper of the quiet garden. Brother Elias woke before the matins bell, his spirit unusually alert. The night had been profoundly still, and he rose knowing that today marked the final, symbolic closure of the pruning cycle. His task would be to address the massive pile of rose canes, the deadwood and the superfluous growth he had removed the previous day. After the morning service, Elias went straight to the composting fire pit, a secluded, stone-ringed space behind the garden shed. The sun was rising, casting a clear, strong light over the garden, but the air remained sharp with cold. He began the final, quiet act of reduction. He hauled the heavy, tangled pile of rose cuttings, the sharp thorns, the brittle deadwood, the thin, unproductive shoots, and arranged them carefully in the center of the pit. He built the fire slowly, placing dry pine cones and thin splinters of aged wood beneath the dense pile of rose canes. He took a single coal, glowing with the heat of the banked kitchen fire, and placed it gently among the tinder. The fire began tentatively, a small, fragile curl of smoke rising into the cold air. Elias knelt, gently feeding it with dry straw, blowing softly onto the embers until the first small flames took hold. The fire was an immediate, powerful symbol of both destruction and purification. As the fire grew, catching the dry, woody canes, it began to crackle and pop. A thick, sweet, sharp smoke rose, the smell of old rosewood and spent life being consumed. Elias stood back, watching the flames grow steadily, transforming the massive, chaotic pile into light, heat, and ash. He watched the thorny, tangled mess he had labored so intensely to remove now surrender completely to the fire. The fire did not judge the wood, it simply refined it, turning the dead, obstructive material into clean energy and fertile ash. Elias saw this as the ultimate spiritual lesson of the garden, the necessity of the fire of purification. All the worries, the failures, the unnecessary complexities of the soul, the spiritual deadwood, must eventually be offered up to the transforming power of grace. The heat of the struggle, the seeming destruction, was merely a process of refinement, turning what was cumbersome into what was useful. The fire burned hot and clear through the late morning. The heat was immense, warming Elias's face and hands, providing a deep, sensory comfort against the cold air. The sound of the crackling wood was a strong, steady rhythm, the music of transformation. By noon, the fire had consumed everything. All that remained was a glowing bed of white-hot embers, settling slowly into a fine, pale gray ash. The air was clean, the smoke gone, and the heavy burden of the deadwood was lifted forever. Elias stirred the embers one final time, then left the pit to cool, knowing the ash, the purified remnant of the sacrifice, would eventually be returned to the soil as a nutrient, completing the cycle of renewal. He walked to the refectory for his midday meal, feeling a profound sense of lightness. His hands were empty, the garden was prepared, and the cycle of death and rebirth was complete. That evening, as Brother Elias lay down in his cot for the final rest, he felt a peace deeper than any before. He thought of the three great certainties: the seed, the promise of life in the dark; the stone, the certainty of foundation; and the fire, the necessity of purification. He closed his eyes, and the final thought settled in his heart like the soft, cool ash in the fire pit. The keeper of the quiet garden is simply the keeper of the conditions. The growth, the peace, and the renewal, these are the work of providence, achieved in the quiet, rich darkness of trust. And in that quietude he slept,